Hello fellow sapiens and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Take a moment to settle in, quiet your thoughts, and let this slow storytelling keep you company, whether you're winding down for sleep, cooking, driving, showering, or simply working with headphones on. This is soft science, not wild speculation, just a humble attempt to share what we know so far, always aware that we don't have every answer. If you find value in these long journeys, consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps this kind of calm, educational storytelling reach others who might also want to conquer the world with knowledge rather than noise. And I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments if you use this while drifting to sleep, or where in the world and in your day you listen. And if you happen to nod off halfway through, I've added timestamps in the description so you can easily return tomorrow. Because this whole story, from beginning to end, is worth hearing. And as always, stay curious. Stay calm. Tonight, we turn to a question that haunts our history. Why are we so violent? And when did it begin? If our ancestors began their story as prey, how could violence ever become part of us? This is not just a philosophical question, but one grounded in the deep past of our species. To imagine the earliest humans as predators in the way we see ourselves today is to forget that for millions of years we were far more often hunted than hunting. From the first hesitant bipeds who left the safety of the trees around 6 million years ago to the sturdier Australopithecines and early members of the genus Homo by 2 million years ago, our ancestors lived with the constant shadow of danger. Large cats, hyenas, crocodiles and raptors would have seen these small, lightly built primates as food. In that world, survival meant being alert, being social, and finding safety not in claws or fangs, but in each other. The fossil record tells this story with sobering clarity. Puncture marks from feline canines appear in skulls of early hominins. A child of Australopithecus africanus, dating to about 3 million years ago, carries the telltale talon marks of a giant eagle attack, discovered in South Africa. Other remains show gnaw marks from large carnivores that fed on our kin. These bones remind us that for much of prehistory, the default position of our lineage was not dominance, but vulnerability. Unlike the later image of humans as apex predators, the early story is one of constant watchfulness, of small bands banding together on open ground where a moment's lapse could mean being dragged into the underbrush or snatched from above. What does this vulnerability have to do with violence? The answer is that being prey shaped our minds in ways that carried forward long after the predators declined. Fear, vigilance, and the urgent need to know who belonged in your group were not luxuries but survival strategies. An individual wandering alone was far more likely to vanish. Safety came through numbers, through recognizing faces, through hearing the alarm calls of kin, and moving together in defense. It was in this crucible that social bonds deepened. Grooming, vocal reassurance, the need to huddle at night around protection. These were responses to a world in which danger lurked beyond the firelight. The earlier sparks of what we might later call aggression grew out of defense, not conquest. A thrown stone or a shouted display was first a way to scare off a predator rather than to harm another of our own. By about 4 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis, famous for the skeleton nicknamed Lucy, was already walking upright in the savannas of East Africa. But this upright stance did not make her species safer. It made them more visible. Their relatively small bodies, averaging less than 1.5 meters tall, lacked the natural armour or weaponry of many other animals. They could not outrun the swift antelopes nor overpower lions. What they could do was spot threats early, stand tall, and use warning gestures to signal the group. The value of a sharp eye and a loud voice became immeasurable. Here lies the first link between our vulnerability and our later capacity for violence. Coordinated defence required coordination of intention. To survive meant sometimes bluffing an enemy, rushing forward together, and projecting force as if to say, "We may look weak, but we are many." It is possible that even rudimentary weapons, nothing more than sticks and stones, became extensions of this need. The earliest stone tools, dating to around 3.5 million years ago in Kenya, were likely used for cutting meat or processing plants, but their presence hints at another use as well: to wave, to strike, to intimidate. No fossilised scene can tell us exactly how often these implements were turned against predators, but logic suggests that any object that extended reach or amplified a blow would have been life-saving. For a small group surrounded by hungry carnivores, the first weapon was not about offence, but about buying time. Time to escape, time to regroup, time to save another member of the band. As our ancestors evolved into the genus Homo around 2.5 million years ago, new traits began to appear. Larger brains, slightly smaller teeth, and changes in hand morphology allowed for more complex tool use. Homo habilis and Homo erectus began to shape stones into sharper edges, and with that came the ability to butcher scavenged carcasses. This too connected vulnerability with violence. By cutting meat from bones abandoned by lions or hyenas, early humans risked confrontations. To scavenge meant to face down larger predators, waving stones and shouting in groups to claim what little was left. This was not yet hunting on a grand scale, but it was the beginning of confrontation, of boldness fueled by desperation. The line between being prey and daring to act like a predator was a fragile one. The bones of Homo erectus found in sites across Africa and Eurasia show both promise and peril. They had longer legs, built for endurance, and skulls more resistant to blows. Yet these very adaptations that made them wander further also exposed them to new threats. In open landscapes of the Rift Valley or the grasslands of Eurasia, Homo erectus would have encountered unfamiliar carnivores and harsh climates. Once again, survival meant cooperation. No lone human ancestor could face a saber-toothed cat, but together, with noise, numbers, and perhaps a barrage of stones, they could buy just enough hesitation from a predator to escape. The need to defend kin and band members meant that aggression, once a purely defensive reflex, began to find more structured outlets. Importantly, the evolutionary pressure here was not simply to fight, but to anticipate. Being prey selects for hyper-awareness, for imagining threats before they arrive. The twitch of grass might conceal a lion, the shadow overhead might hide an eagle. This anticipatory vigilance may have been the seed of what later became strategy, planning, and even the capacity to direct violence not just against predators, but against rivals. But in these earliest times, from 6 million to 2 million years ago, what mattered most was not who could kill, but who could keep the group alive long enough to raise offspring. Empathy too has roots in this era. The scream of another under attack had to matter, or no one would come to help. The social brain grew in tandem with the necessity of shared defence. In this way, violence, if we can call it that, crept in through the back door of evolution. It was never first about conquest. It was about fending off lions, defending a child, scaring away a rival pack of hyenas. Every scar left by a predator's tooth, every fossil bone cracked open for marrow, every talon mark on an ancient skull tells the same story. To be human, at the beginning, was to be food. Our aggression was a byproduct of refusing to accept that role entirely. We shouted, we struck, we gathered closer, and from that refusal grew a capacity that would one day transform into something much darker and far more complicated. The haunting question is this: if violence began as defence, a way of keeping the night at bay, at what point did it turn inward? When did the tools that once waved at lions begin to point at each other? That story lies further ahead, but the foundation is here, in a world where the first humans survived by not being eaten. Was the first weapon built to kill animals, or to turn against each other? This is a question that trails us back into the deep past of 2 million to 500,000 years ago, when stone tools became a central feature of human life. It is here, in the age of Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and their close kin, that we find evidence not only of innovation, but of what that innovation meant for survival, and for the darker potentials of human interaction. Stones broken into sharp edges, hand axes sculpted into symmetry, bones split for marrow. These were the signatures of our ancestors as they stepped further from the role of prey. And yet every chipped tool raises an unsettling possibility. If it can cut meat, it can cut flesh. If it can strike an antelope's tendon, it can strike a skull. The Oldowan tradition, the earliest widely recognised stone tool industry, stretches back more than 2.5 million years. By 2 million years ago, it had become a defining marker of Homo habilis and early Homo erectus. These were not sophisticated artifacts by modern standards. Simple flakes struck from a core, sharp enough to slice through hide, to sever muscle, to free marrow from bone. But their presence at sites across East Africa signals a profound shift. With Oldowan tools, hominins could process carcasses faster, extract more calories, and defend themselves more effectively. A fossilised zebra bone from Kenya bears the linear cuts of stone blades, proof that humans were no longer limited to scavenging scraps torn apart by hyenas. They could intervene earlier, claiming portions of meat that would otherwise be lost. And this changed the balance of power. To carry a flake was to carry a portable claw, a new edge in a dangerous world. By around 1.5 million years ago, a new tradition arose, Acheulean tools, marked by the iconic hand axe. Unlike the rough flakes of Oldowan culture, these tools displayed deliberate shaping. Homo erectus and later Homo heidelbergensis invested time and effort into creating bifacial implements with symmetrical edges. This required planning, patience, and a shared tradition of teaching. A hand axe was not merely a sharp stone. It was a multi-purpose instrument, used for butchering, digging, and chopping. The very symmetry suggests an aesthetic sense, though we must be cautious not to project too much. What is certain is that Acheulean tools made humans far more efficient predators and scavengers. Large animal bones at sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya bear cut marks showing that hominins with hand axes could strip carcasses quickly, competing with lions and hyenas for flesh. But again, the question lingers. Were these tools used only against animals? Fossil evidence suggests otherwise. Several Homo erectus skulls from this period display trauma inconsistent with predator attack. At sites in Kenya and Georgia, fractures on skulls show signs of blunt force trauma from objects suspiciously similar in size and shape to stone tools. One particularly famous case comes from Bodo, Ethiopia, where a roughly 600,000-year-old Homo heidelbergensis skull shows repeated cut marks across the face and cranium. Whether these marks represent cannibalism, ritual defleshing, or interpersonal violence remains debated. But what they confirm is that stone tools could be turned against humans. The line between butchering an antelope and harming a neighbour was thin indeed. Another telling case comes from the fossil record of Sanggar in Indonesia, where several Homo erectus skulls show healed fractures, evidence that individuals survived blows to the head. Such injuries are unlikely to have come from predators. They look far more like the results of conflict with other hominins. The fact that some healed indicates that violence was not always fatal, but it was present, woven into the daily life of these early communities. The use of tools may not have been primarily for fighting, but once sharp stones were in hand, the possibility could never be erased. The bones of animals themselves also reveal this dual potential. At Torralba and Ambrona in Spain, concentrations of elephant bones have been interpreted as evidence of large-game hunting by early humans using Acheulean tools. Yet some archaeologists argue these were scavenging sites where carcasses were butchered after natural deaths. The debate underscores the ambiguity of the evidence. Were these hominins hunters or opportunists? Either way, to approach an elephant carcass with a hand axe in hand was to risk confrontation with predators, with rivals, perhaps with one another. Violence in this context was not abstract. It was the price of meat. And yet, for all the evidence of trauma, we must resist the temptation to paint this period as a constant war of all against all. Most tools were almost certainly used for daily subsistence. Cut marks on animal bones outnumber marks on hominin bones by orders of magnitude. The dominant story is still one of survival, not murder. But the capacity had been unlocked. By 2 million years ago, humans carried with them the means to both feed and harm, to protect and to wound. A stone flake was no longer just an accident of geology. It was a decision made by hands and minds, with consequences for life and death. It is worth pausing to reflect on what this meant for social life. To live in a group where everyone carried sharp tools was to live in a world of heightened stakes. Cooperation was necessary, but so was trust. The scars on ancient skulls remind us that trust was sometimes broken. If we think of violence as an evolutionary puzzle, it is here that the pieces begin to fit together. Being prey had taught our ancestors to band together. Being toolmakers gave them new power, and somewhere in that overlap lay the danger of turning power against one another. The haunting question is whether violence was inevitable once tools were invented. Could we ever have learned to cut meat without also cutting each other? Or was the dual-use nature of stone, the way it slices both hide and skin, destined to follow us from the very first flake? That we cannot answer fully. But what we do know is that between 2 million and 500,000 years ago, the seeds of human violence were sown not by conquest, not by armies, but by the simple act of chipping stone. The story of teeth and tools is not only about what humans struck from stone, but also about how these objects reshaped the very rhythm of daily life. Once flakes and hand axes became regular companions, diets expanded dramatically. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kubifora in Kenya shows that hominins with stone tools could exploit marrow, brains and tendons, foods rich in fat and protein that would otherwise be inaccessible. These resources were critical in environments where fruit or tubers might vanish in a season of drought. A cut bone was more than nutrition, it was insurance, a safeguard against hunger. But to claim that insurance meant competition, not just with carnivores, but with neighbouring groups who might also stumble upon the same carcass. When food was scarce, proximity could tip into conflict. The Acheulean hand axe especially embodies this paradox. Its symmetrical form is almost unnecessarily refined if the only goal was to cut meat. Some researchers have suggested it also served as a signal, a crafted object that showed skill, patience, and social knowledge. To hold a finely shaped hand axe was to demonstrate competence in a way others could see. If this is true, then tools were not just about survival, but also about status, and status often comes with tension. The very act of producing these tools could create hierarchies, drawing lines between the skilled and the less skilled, between those who could lead and those who followed. And whenever status takes shape, so too does the risk of violence. Fossil evidence from sites outside Africa adds another layer. In Europe, early Homo heidelbergensis left behind not only hand axes but signs of group hunting. Spears found at Schöningen in Germany, dated to around 400,000 years ago, suggest that humans coordinated to bring down large animals such as horses. Cooperation at this scale is impressive, requiring planning and shared risk. Yet cooperation in hunting could easily mirror cooperation in aggression. The ability to coordinate an ambush against prey might transfer under strain to an ambush against rivals. Violence, in other words, was not a separate invention, but a potential byproduct of skills already honed for survival. The bones of Homo erectus also reveal something subtler, healed injuries that point to long-term care. Individuals with broken limbs lived long enough for bones to mend, meaning others must have helped them survive. This reminds us that early humans were not only capable of striking one another, but also of protecting, feeding, and supporting each other. Violence and compassion coexisted, both made possible by the same tools and social bonds. A hand axe could wound, but it could also cut wood for fire or butcher food for a weakened companion. The tool itself carried no intent. It was the choices of the group that gave it meaning. By 500,000 years ago, then, our ancestors had established a dual legacy. They were hunters as well as hunted, capable of crafting sharp instruments that expanded their diets, transformed their landscapes, and changed their relationships. But they also carried within their toolkits the possibility of bloodshed among themselves. The early record shows not a world drenched in constant violence, but one where the door had been opened. Once stone became weapon as well as implement. That door could never fully close again. Could this be the first known murder scene? That is the unsettling question raised by a discovery deep in the caves of northern Spain, where a chamber now famous as Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, holds the remains of at least 28 ancient humans. These individuals lived around 450,000 years ago, likely belonging to a population ancestral to the later Neanderthals. Their bones, jumbled in the darkness of Atapuerca's caves, give us an eerie window into life and death in the Middle Pleistocene. Among them, one skull in particular has drawn scientific attention, Cranium 17, a battered remnant that may hold the earliest clear evidence of deliberate killing. The skull is incomplete, but enough remains to reconstruct the face and the frontal portion of the cranium. What stands out are two fractures above the left eye socket. Each is deep, oval in shape, and almost identical in size. Forensic analysis suggests they were caused by blunt force trauma, delivered with a rounded object of similar shape to a stone tool or club. Their symmetry is striking. Both blows landed at nearly the same angle, in almost the same place, with force sufficient to fracture bone. Most importantly, they were not injuries consistent with accident. A fall from height might cause a fracture, but rarely two so alike, so close together. The pattern points instead to deliberate action. Someone struck this individual twice in quick succession, aiming at the face. In forensic terms, the injuries are perimortem, meaning they occurred around the time of death, before the bone had time to heal. There is no evidence of recovery, no signs of survival. Whoever Cranium 17 belonged to, they died as a direct result of these blows. If we accept this interpretation, then we are looking at something profound, the oldest known case of homicide in the human lineage. 450,000 years ago, deep in the Middle Pleistocene, one human struck another down, face to face. But science moves carefully, and there are always alternative explanations to weigh. Could this have been the result of a rockfall inside the cave? The researchers at Atapuerca considered this. The angles of the fractures, however, do not match the typical breakage from falling debris, nor do they resemble the random scatter of post-mortem damage that bones often accumulate in caves. The parallelism of the blows is simply too precise. Another possibility is that the injuries were inflicted accidentally during some kind of accident outside the cave, but here again the evidence leans toward intention. When the same instrument leaves the same wound twice, it is hard not to imagine the deliberate swing of a hand. The broader context of Cima de los Huesos adds further complexity. The chamber is not a natural living space. It lies at the bottom of a steep shaft difficult to access, and the accumulation of bodies there is still debated. Some argue it was a natural trap into which individuals fell. Others suggest it may have been a place where the dead were deliberately deposited, a kind of proto-burial practice centuries before symbolic rituals are usually thought to appear. Whatever the explanation, the presence of so many individuals in one place makes the violent end of Cranium 17 stand out all the more. The discovery forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities. If this was indeed murder, what motivated it? Was it a clash between rivals in a small group? A punishment for breaking social norms? A moment of rage? We cannot know. What we can say is that by this time, humans were capable not only of inflicting fatal harm on one another, but of doing so in ways that suggest intention. Violence was no longer only the outcome of predator attack or the desperate competition over carcasses. It could also emerge from within the group itself. The significance of this is not only in the single skull, it lies in the recognition that violence leaves durable marks in the fossil record. Bones preserve trauma in ways that stories cannot. For Cranium 17, those twin blows are as eloquent as any written confession. They remind us that human history is not only the tale of cooperation and care, but also of conflict and harm. The same species that could carry injured companions, as we know from healed fractures in other fossils, could also strike them down. Compassion and cruelty existed side by side, long before modern humans emerged. And yet, even here, humility is essential. To call this the first murder is tempting but risky. Our record is patchy. We may simply be missing earlier cases, washed away by time. What survives in the caves of Atapuerca is a rare preservation of bone, a snapshot in deep history. It may be the first case we can see clearly, but surely it was not the first time such an act occurred. How far back deliberate killing stretches we cannot know. What we can say is that by 450,000 years ago, the potential for homicide was part of our species' broader lineage. This raises a haunting question. Was violence ever truly absent from our evolution, or has it always been with us, surfacing whenever the fragile balance of cooperation broke down? Cranium 17 does not answer that, but it whispers to us from the dark of the pit of bones, a reminder that the story of humanity has always carried within it both light and shadow. What makes the pit of bones even more fascinating is the way it ties violence to questions of community. To understand the blow that ended Cranium 17's life, we have to imagine the small group around them. Middle Pleistocene humans did not live in vast populations. Bands were likely measured in dozens, perhaps a few families bound together. In such close quarters, the death of one member would not have gone unnoticed. If the blows were deliberate, then others almost certainly knew what had happened. That knowledge alone makes this case more than an isolated act. It becomes a clue to the social fabric in which violence could occur. Murder is not simply a physical act. It is a social rupture. The choice of where the body ended up also deepens the mystery. If Cima de los Huesos was indeed a place where bodies were deliberately placed, then the community made a decision to deposit even this individual, despite their violent end, among others. Was this an early form of respect, or simply a matter of convenience? If it was respect, then it suggests that group cohesion extended even to those who may have died in conflict. If it was convenience, it shows that practical concerns could outweigh any moral hesitation. Either way, the deposition of the body means that violence and belonging were not mutually exclusive. You could be struck down by another human and still be laid to rest by the group. Comparisons to accidental trauma help us sharpen the picture. At other fossil sites, skulls display fractures from falls, animal attacks, or the natural collapse of bone after burial. These usually produce irregular breaks, scattered across different parts of the skull. Cranium 17, by contrast, tells a different story. Two carefully placed blows in nearly identical locations. The precision suggests not only intention but also skill. To strike twice in the same spot requires control. This in turn implies that the act was not one of wild flailing but of deliberate targeting. In other words, someone knew what they were doing. What does this say about the evolution of violence? It shows that by the Middle Pleistocene, humans were not only capable of aggression, but of directed, lethal violence that looks less like an accident and more like an execution. This does not mean murder was common. If it were, we would expect more skeletons with similar signs. The rarity suggests that it was exceptional, but still possible, and possibility is enough. Once a species can commit deliberate homicide, the evolutionary landscape shifts. Trust must be negotiated differently. Rules, formal or informal, begin to matter. That is why Cima de los Huesos matters so much. It is not only about the tragic fate of one individual, but about the threshold it represents. The Pit of Bones reminds us that violence was woven into our past long before cities, kingdoms, or armies. It did not require organised warfare or massive populations. It required only tools, intention, and a fracture in social bonds. The haunting question is how groups responded. Did they punish the killer? Did they shrug and carry on? Or did they invent, in ways lost to us, the earliest seeds of justice? We cannot know. But the silence of the pit forces us to imagine, and to accept that even in the shadows of deep time, the potential for both cruelty and care was already part of being human. When almost humans met each other, what happened? Between 300 and 200,000 years ago, the world was shared by several lineages that stood close to our own. Early Homo sapiens were already present in Africa, their bones appearing in sites like Florisbad and Omo. In Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals were taking shape, their distinctive skulls and bodies adapted to cold climates. In other parts of the Old World, archaic humans, often grouped under names like Homo heidelbergensis, lingered in varied forms. This was a time when our family tree was less like a straight trunk and more like a braided stream, with branches splitting, reconnecting, and diverging again. These meetings were not recorded in words, but in the evidence left on bones and in the tools carried in hand. Some of those bones carry marks of violence. At Schöningen in northern Germany, wooden spears dated to around 300,000 years ago were discovered, preserved in ancient lake sediments. These long, carefully shaped hunting weapons are some of the earliest evidence of humans making thrusting and throwing tools out of wood. They were balanced, heavy at one end, aerodynamic enough to be used for targeting large animals such as horses. Their discovery proved that humans of this time were not only opportunistic scavengers, but skilled hunters, capable of coordinated attacks. Yet a spear that can pierce a horse's hide can also pierce human skin. The presence of these weapons raises the question: how often were they used against one another? The fossil record offers some disturbing hints. At sites in Europe associated with Neanderthals and their close relatives, skeletal remains occasionally bear wounds suggestive of interpersonal violence. A skull from Bodo, Ethiopia, dating to roughly this era, shows cut marks that may indicate defleshing after death. The intention behind this remains debated. Was it cannibalism, a ritual act, or something else entirely? But the fact remains that sharp tools were applied to human bone. In Spain, remains from Cima de los Huesos suggest earlier violence, but by this period such marks appear more frequently, reflecting a world where conflict was no longer rare. One striking case comes from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where Neanderthal remains show a punctured rib. The injury appears consistent with a projectile weapon, possibly a thrusting spear driven into the side of the body. It is not definitive proof of homicide. The individual may have fallen onto the weapon accidentally, or it may have been inflicted in a hunting mishap. But the possibility lingers that this was one of the first recorded instances of one human striking another with a purpose-built weapon. If so, it would suggest that violence had become entangled not only with fists and stones, but with tools specifically designed to extend reach and power. The appearance of trauma on these archaic skeletons hints at more than isolated events. It suggests that groups living in proximity may have clashed. Territory mattered. Valleys rich in game or rivers rich in fish would have been worth defending. Population densities were still low, but even sparse groups could come into contact at critical resource points. Unlike later mass graves that show organised massacres, the evidence here is individual and sporadic, suggesting skirmishes rather than wars. Still, to stand at arm's length and drive a spear into another body is a decisive escalation in human violence. It shows planning, intent, and a willingness to risk retaliation. At the same time, this period was also marked by interbreeding. Genetic evidence has shown that early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals exchanged DNA long before the more famous mixing around 60,000 years ago. This means encounters were not always hostile. They also included unions that left descendants. The duality is striking. The same meeting of groups could yield both intimacy and injury. Some nights may have ended in the sharing of firelight, others in the thrust of a spear. To be human in this period was to walk the thin line between cooperation and conflict. When we look at these early overlaps, it is tempting to search for patterns. Were Neanderthals more violent than Homo sapiens? Was one lineage more prone to aggression? The evidence does not allow such easy judgments. Injuries are scattered across sites associated with multiple species. What unites them is not species difference, but shared vulnerability. All humans, whether in Africa, Europe or Asia, lived in a world of high risk, where disputes could turn deadly, and where the tools of survival could double as weapons. The haunting aspect of this evidence is not its scale, but its intimacy. Unlike the wars of later millennia, these were face-to-face encounters. A spear thrust required closeness. A blow to the skull required direct contact. Violence here was not abstracted by distance. It was personal, immediate, and likely unforgettable to those who survived. The scars would have been carried not only in bone but in memory, shaping how groups viewed strangers, how they negotiated territory, and how they weighed the risks of meeting others. What lessons can we take from this? That violence did not need vast populations or armies to appear. It needed only proximity, competition, and the tools already present for hunting. Between 300 and 200,000 years ago, humans were learning to manage both the promise and peril of encountering those like themselves. Some encounters left children who carried mixed ancestry. Others left skeletons with shattered ribs or fractured skulls. The question we are left with is whether these meetings were tipping points in our nature. Did early killings plant the seeds of later organised violence, or were they anomalies in a mostly cooperative past? We cannot know for certain. But we can say this. From the moment humans held spears in their hands and met others who were both strange and familiar, the possibility of bloodshed was always there, and that possibility would follow us into every era that came after. What do broken bones tell us? Ritual, starvation, or cruelty? Between 160,000 years ago and 100,000 years ago, scattered remains across Europe raise questions that are as unsettling as they are unresolved. When we look closely at certain Neanderthal bones, what we see are not just fractures from natural decay or predatory scavenging, but but cut marks, scrapes, and breaks in patterns familiar to archaeologists who study the butchery of animals. These marks are deliberate, intentional, and consistent with humans taking apart their own kind. The question that haunts us is why? At Krapina in modern-day Croatia, excavations at the turn of the 20th century unearthed a large assemblage of Neanderthal bones, dating to roughly 130,000 years ago. These bones belong to dozens of individuals of different ages and sexes, and they tell a troubling story. Many of them bear cut marks in locations where muscles would have been attached. Some long bones were fractured in ways that suggest deliberate breaking to access marrow. Others were cracked open in a manner identical to how Neanderthals processed animal bones for nutrition. This evidence has led many scholars to propose cannibalism, whether driven by hunger during a time of scarcity or as part of a cultural practice that is harder for us to interpret. The case of Moula-Gersi cave in France, dating to around 100,000 years ago, provides similarly disturbing hints. Here, the remains of at least 6 Neanderthal individuals were found with unmistakable signs of systematic butchery. The cut marks on skulls, ribs, and long bones mirror those found on deer and other prey processed at the same site. In some cases, tongues appear to have been removed, long bones smashed for marrow, and muscle groups stripped away with precision. The argument for cannibalism here is difficult to escape, but again the motives are not clear. Was this a group under environmental duress, reduced to consuming its own dead? Or did this reflect a practice of ritual, where consuming the flesh of one's kin or rival carried symbolic meaning we can no longer recover? The ambiguity is the point. Archaeology gives us bones, but not intentions. We can see the physical traces of what was done, but not the emotional or social framework around it. Even if cannibalism was practiced, it does not necessarily map onto cruelty as we might define it. In many cultures across time, the treatment of the dead through defleshing, dismemberment, or even consumption has been framed not as desecration but as care. It is possible that Neanderthals who cut into their dead were engaging in a practice that meant something entirely different to them, something about continuity, remembrance, or maintaining bonds after death. Adding to this complexity is the evidence of care among Neanderthals. At sites like Shanidar in Iraq, skeletons show individuals who lived long after sustaining severe injuries or disabilities, injuries that would have required extended assistance from others in their group. One man had lost an arm, suffered facial trauma that likely blinded him in one eye, and endured arthritis in multiple joints, yet survived for years. This tells us that Neanderthal groups could nurture and protect their vulnerable members. The same hands capable of breaking bones for marrow were also capable of feeding, protecting, and healing. This duality is perhaps what makes these cases so difficult for us to place neatly into categories. The bones at Krapina and Moula-Gersi do not only tell a story of violence, they tell a story of desperation and choice, of survival and cultural complexity. If cannibalism occurred during times of starvation, then these acts may not represent cruelty but necessity. If they were part of ritual, then they may reflect a symbolic logic foreign to us but deeply meaningful to them. The fractures themselves leave us with more questions than answers. Were these events rare responses to extraordinary circumstances, or were they a more common aspect of Neanderthal life that we only occasionally glimpse in the archaeological record? The scattered nature of the evidence suggests they were not everyday occurrences, yet the fact that we find them across different regions, separated by hundreds of miles and thousands of years, implies that cannibalism, whatever its meaning, was a recurring possibility within human evolution. For us, raised in cultures that largely treat cannibalism as one of the greatest taboos, these findings are hard to absorb without judgment. But if we set aside our preconceptions, what we see is less about monstrous behaviour and more about the versatility of human response to stress and mortality. Violence, in these cases, may not have been aggression at all. It may have been survival, or even reverence. And so the haunting question remains. When we peer at bones with cut marks and cracks, are we seeing cruelty or care? Were Neanderthals devouring each other out of hunger, or tending to their dead in a way that demanded the breaking of bone and removal of flesh? We will never know with certainty. But in that uncertainty lies an important reminder that human behaviour, even in its most unsettling forms, is complex, situational, and often driven by needs and beliefs we can only partially understand. The wider backdrop of these disturbing but fascinating finds is the world Neanderthals inhabited between 160,000 and 60,000 years ago. Europe and Western Asia were gripped by repeated glacial cycles, with ecosystems swinging violently between habitable forests and open, barren tundra. These abrupt shifts meant that populations were frequently pushed to the edge of survival. Large prey animals, the lifeblood of hunter-gatherer groups, could vanish from a region within a few generations, forcing bands to either move, adapt, or perish. It is within these periods of scarcity that episodes of bone breaking and flesh removal begin to make more sense, not as aberrations, but as possible responses to famine. In this light, the cut marks on human remains at Krapina or Mulagasi may have less to do with cruelty and more with sheer environmental pressure. Another layer of interpretation is the role of conflict between groups. The Neanderthal world was not densely populated, but contact between neighbouring groups must have occurred. When resources dwindled, such encounters may not always have been peaceful. If some of the cut-marked bones represent defeated rivals rather than members of one's own group, then the line between survival and violence blurs even further. Were these acts pragmatic recycling of enemy bodies, or symbolic gestures of domination, marking victory in ways that left their trace on the skeletons we study today? Archaeology cannot answer the intention, but it can point us toward possibilities. Interestingly, at some sites the pattern of modification is not random. Certain bones appear more frequently broken or cut than others, suggesting a preference. This hints at practices that could be cultural rather than purely utilitarian. For example, the systematic breaking of skulls or the selective removal of specific body parts might reflect beliefs about the soul, identity, or the transition between life and death. Even if cannibalism was practiced, it might not have been done to degrade, but rather to transform. At the same time, we must resist the temptation to generalize. For every site with ambiguous signs of cannibalism, there are others where burials show clear signs of deliberate respect. Bodies laid in shallow graves, sometimes with grave goods or flowers, remind us that Neanderthals had a wide range of responses to death. The same species that left cut marks on bone could also mark the ground with careful burials. This diversity makes it difficult to define them with simple labels like violent or compassionate. They appear to have been capable of both extremes just as we are. What is striking is how these early cases foreshadow debates we still have today about the meaning of violence, ritual and respect. Is breaking down a body always an act of harm, or can it be an act of care? Does consuming or dismantling the dead necessarily strip them of dignity, or might it have been understood as returning them to the community in a different form? These are questions that reach far beyond archaeology and touch on the very foundations of how humans everywhere navigate mortality. The lesson may be less about whether Neanderthals were cannibals, and more about the dangers of reading our own taboos backward into the deep past. The bones themselves tell us only that flesh was removed, marrow was consumed, and bones were broken. The why remains suspended in mystery. And perhaps it is in that mystery that we find the most revealing truth of all, that our lineage has always lived at the edge of survival, always balancing violence and care and always leaving traces that defy easy explanation. If war is often thought of as the child of farming and cities, born from land boundaries and surpluses to defend, the evidence from the late Pleistocene unsettles that idea. Between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, long before crops and cattle, we begin to find signs that groups of hunter-gatherers were not merely hunters of animals, but, at times, hunters of each other. The question then becomes, did organised human violence emerge not with farming, but with the moment when our ancestors began to look at their neighbours as rivals? The most haunting clues come not from shattered walls or burned villages, but from the bones themselves. In the caves of Iraq, the famous Shanidar site yielded a Neanderthal skeleton with a punctured rib. The wound is consistent with a projectile weapon, a spear or dart that pierced through flesh and bone. What is most striking is that the angle and force of impact suggest deliberate aim, not an accident. Whether it came from a hunting mishap or a fight between individuals, the fact remains. Neanderthals and early humans already had the technology to kill each other from a distance. That alone marks a turning point. To kill from afar is to reduce the risk to oneself and to expand the possibilities of ambush. It is one of the quiet revolutions in human violence. Other sites reinforce this story of early trauma. Skulls dated to this period sometimes carry depressed fractures, blows that were not healed, likely delivered in combat rather than by accident. Arms and ribs show signs of parry fractures, the kind that form when someone raises a limb to block an incoming strike. These are the silent testimonies of small-scale encounters, not the annihilation of whole populations, but sudden clashes where bodies bore the marks of both attack and defence. What stands out in this era is the scale. We're not yet looking at armies or fortifications. Instead, the violence seems intimate. Small bands of hunter-gatherers, living close to the edge of survival, may have competed for watering holes, game trails, or seasonal foraging grounds. In such circumstances, even a brief confrontation could leave lasting scars. Ambushes were likely, given the landscape of caves, gorges, and river valleys that characterized Ice Age Eurasia. A handful of individuals waiting in silence could change the fate of a neighbouring group in a matter of minutes, and yet alongside these traces of violence, we also see the flourishing of cooperation and creativity. The same people who may have driven spears into rivals were painting animals on cave walls, carving beads, and experimenting with new ways of organising their lives. Violence was one thread in a larger tapestry, and it did not define them wholly, but its presence cannot be ignored. The introduction of long-range weapons during this period matters deeply. Stone-tipped projectiles allowed for killing at a distance, and with that came the possibility of coordinated attacks. A group could stand at the mouth of a valley and rain down deadly points on intruders. The balance of power shifted. To be ambushed by a hidden group with ranged weapons was to face death without even closing the distance. For the first time, killing could be not only personal but tactical. The broader question remains unsolved. Should these early cases of trauma be called war? Some scholars argue that war requires scale, organisation, and political purpose, while these Ice Age clashes were sporadic, situational, and small. Others insist that the essence of war is not numbers but intent, the decision to target other humans as enemies. If that is the definition, then the evidence suggests that humans invented war long before farming. Perhaps the deeper revelation is that humans carried into the future both capacities at once, to cooperate in remarkable new ways and to turn those same skills of planning, communication and strategy toward violence against their own kind. War then may not have begun with crops or kings, but with the realization that another band of humans was too close, too successful, or simply too threatening. And so, as the Ice Age nights stretched long and cold, some groups may have told stories by the fire about raids, ambushes, and fallen kin. For them, the memory of violence would have been as real as the hunt, as real as the painted walls of caves. And perhaps the haunting question is this: if humans were already capable of war while still nomads, what hope did we ever have of leaving it behind once we settled down? If we look more closely at these late Pleistocene landscapes, another subtle but important factor comes into view: mobility itself. Groups that ranged widely had the advantage of avoiding rivals altogether, but they also risked stumbling into unfamiliar territories. Unlike the slow expansion of farming villages thousands of years later, hunter-gatherer ranges overlapped unpredictably. Two groups moving toward the same herd of migrating game or the same stretch of river could suddenly collide. In those moments there was little room for diplomacy. With no shared language, no treaties, and often no second chances, violence may have seemed like the only reliable solution. Evidence for these encounters is not only etched into bones, but also hinted at in the sudden disappearance of populations from particular regions. Archaeologists sometimes find layers of habitation abruptly ending without signs of environmental collapse. Fire pits, stone tools, and shelters vanish, replaced only centuries later by signs of new occupants. While not conclusive, such gaps invite the unsettling possibility that local groups were pushed out or eliminated entirely by rivals. These were not the sweeping conquests of later empires, but on the scale of small Ice Age bands, the disappearance of even a few families could be the equivalent of cultural extinction. The tools themselves whisper another clue. Spears with carefully napped points were not just useful for hunting aurochs or reindeer. They were equally suited to penetrating human flesh. In fact, the shift from simple thrusting spears to lighter projectiles suggests a growing understanding of tactical flexibility. A thrusting spear demanded close contact. A lighter weapon could be hurled from a distance, allowing attackers to strike without immediate reprisal. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that these advances, while undoubtedly aimed at animals, also increased the lethality of human conflict when it did erupt. We can imagine, too, how his stories may have amplified the cycle of violence. Oral traditions preserved the memory of kin killed by strangers, or of ambushes survived by chance. These stories, repeated around the fire, may have hardened attitudes toward outsiders. They did not need to describe organised war to create a mindset of suspicion. If another band appeared on the horizon, it was not a blank slate. It was a potential threat already coloured by tales of past violence. Suspicion, in other words, could be inherited. It is easy to romanticise these hunter-gatherer societies as living in perpetual balance with nature, untouched by the darker impulses of later civilizations. Yet the bones, the tools, and the disappearances remind us that violence is not simply a product of farming or kingship. It is as old as the sharpened stone, as enduring as the human need to protect kin and territory. The Ice Age hunter crouching with a spear in the shadows of a gorge was already, in a very real sense, a soldier. And what makes this sobering is not that war began early, but that it began before we even had fields to fight over. Did jewellery and body paint invent us versus them? The idea feels deceptively modern, as though political banners, flags and team jerseys belong only to cities and states. Yet if we follow the evidence far enough back, into the Upper Paleolithic, we find that humans began to do something strangely new, decorating themselves in ways that signalled more than beauty. They were marking identity. Around 40,000 years ago, in the deep chill of an Ice Age Europe filled with vast herds of reindeer and mammoth, people were gathering in numbers larger than any single family band. Archaeologists call these places aggregation sites. They were seasonal meeting points where scattered groups came together, perhaps to exchange mates, to share knowledge, or to trade materials like obsidian, shells, or ochre. For most of human prehistory, strangers had been rare, an occasional figure glimpsed across the horizon. Suddenly, with these meetings, strangers became normal, and once strangers existed, so did the need to tell them apart. That is where the beads, pendants, and pigments come in. From sites in Africa, Eurasia, and the Levant, we find pierced shells strung as necklaces, animal teeth with wear marks from being suspended, and stones rubbed smooth from being handled as tokens. At first glance, they may look trivial compared to the grand cave paintings that would come later, but in their time they carried something profound. They told others who you were. The ochre streak across a cheek was not merely art. It was a statement that said, "I belong to the group from that river valley." The shell necklace signalled that its wearer had kinship ties to people living by the coast, even if she now stood hundreds of kilometres inland. Pat Shipman and others have suggested that this was the first invention of colours, not in the painter's sense, but in the way urban gangs or medieval armies would later adopt them. You did not need a flag when every member of your group wore the same beads or tattoo patterns, and for the first time, humans could know at a glance whether the stranger before them was one of us or one of them. Why does this matter for violence? Because once visible markers existed, trust and suspicion became instantaneous. Before, a stranger might have needed to exchange words, to gesture, to prove intentions over days of interaction. Now, the jewellery or pigment carried its own message. It said, "Approach safely," or "Beware." In a world where resources were scarce, that clarity could be life-saving, but it could also harden divisions. The archaeological record bears out how far this signalling spread. At sites like Sungir in Russia, burials more than 30,000 years old contain thousands of painstakingly carved ivory beads sewn into clothing. At Kostenki, also in Russia, clusters of ornaments suggest that different families within the same camp may have displayed slightly different identities, perhaps rival subgroups. And in Africa, still earlier, ochre pieces from Blombos Cave show scratches and carvings, abstract marks whose only plausible function was symbolic. Taken together, these objects hint that by 40,000 years ago, humans had entered a new social world where belonging had to be performed, displayed and recognised. This was not war in the organised sense, but it was a foundation. Once group identity was displayed outwardly, it was easier to enforce the boundaries of who could be trusted and who could not. Violence could now be triggered not by accident, but by symbols themselves. If you wore the wrong beads, or bore no mark at all, you might not even be given the chance to explain. It is important to resist the temptation to imagine these early ornaments as crude versions of modern nationalism. They were not flags of empires, they were not uniforms of soldiers. They were quieter, more intimate markers, probably made by hand within families, passed from parent to child. Yet the effect was cumulative. With every gathering, every exchange, the sense of my people and their people deepened. We begin to glimpse the psychological roots of something that would later drive human history on a scale of continents: the willingness to defend symbols, even with blood. But the ambiguity remains. Were these ornaments a path to violence or to peace? At aggregation sites, they may have reduced conflict, not increased it. By making identity visible, misunderstandings could be avoided. A bead string might say, "I am not your enemy. I am from the neighbouring valley that always shares reindeer meat." In that case, symbols were not weapons. They were peace treaties worn on the body. Yet the same clarity that allowed trust also allowed hostility to be concentrated. When resources ran low, the line between decoration and target could blur. We are left, as so often in archaeology, with an unsettling double-edged answer. Symbols may have been the earliest way humans built larger communities, expanding beyond the circle of kin, but they also planted the seeds of us and them, of divisions that could harden into suspicion and eventually conflict. What we see in beads and body paint 40,000 years ago is the beginning of a story still with us today. The struggle to expand who belongs in us before them becomes an excuse for violence. And so the question lingers. When our ancestors first strung those shells and painted their bodies with ochre, were they inventing cooperation, or were they inventing war by another name? Was this the first battlefield grave? It is a question that lingers over a quiet bend of the Nile in northern Sudan, where the desert today seems endless, but where, 13 to 14,000 years ago, water and life converged in a very different way. Here at a place archaeologists call Jebel Sahaba, the bones of dozens of ancient people tell a story that is both hauntingly familiar and chillingly alien. We are looking at a cemetery where violence was not an exception, but a condition of life. When the site was excavated in the 1960s, archaeologists uncovered more than 60 skeletons buried within a relatively small space. At first glance, it looked like a typical late Pleistocene cemetery, perhaps a community laying its dead to rest near a river that had sustained them. But the bones quickly revealed a darker truth. Many of the skeletons carried embedded stone projectile points, microliths lodged in spines, ribs and pelvises, sometimes still fixed exactly where they struck. Others showed healed injuries, cuts and punctures that had scarred over during life, only for new wounds to eventually end it. This was not a one-time slaughter. It was evidence of repeated conflict, generation after generation, in the same community. The picture that emerges is not of a single battle, but of a long siege of existence. Many of the dead were women and children. This alone is important, because it rules out the simplest explanation, that these were just warriors killed far from home and buried together. Instead, the victims represent a cross-section of daily life, suggesting that raids came at the very heart of settlements, cutting across families and striking down the vulnerable as well as the strong. Why here? Geography may hold the answer. At the end of the Ice Age, the Nile Valley was a lifeline in a harsh and shifting environment. Populations clustered around its waters, and in times of drought or unpredictable climate swings, its resources became contested. Groups that might once have kept distance from each other were now pressed together. In such a situation, even small differences in access to fishing grounds, to water crossings, or to hunting territories could escalate. The result was conflict that no longer involved just individuals but whole groups. The archaeological details are as compelling as they are grim. More than 40% of the individuals at Jebel Sahaba show clear evidence of violent injury. Some had as many as 20 projectile points associated with their skeletons. A few even show signs of being struck from behind, implying ambush rather than open confrontation. Importantly, many skeletons reveal both healed and fresh wounds. That tells us this community did not suffer violence once, but repeatedly, perhaps across decades. They lived in expectation of attack, endured it, and then endured it again. What makes Jebel Sahaba so critical in our understanding of human violence is the way it bridges eras. These burials date to the very end of the Pleistocene, just before the Holocene begins and farming societies start to appear. They show that organised, group-level violence was not the invention of agriculture or states, but had already begun among hunter-gatherers competing over land and food. It was not war as later empires would define it, with armies, generals and strategies. But it was something close enough that to the people living through it the difference hardly mattered. And there is another detail that archaeologists continue to debate: the burials themselves. Despite the trauma, these bodies were carefully interred. They were not dumped, abandoned or discarded. Someone took the time to lay them down, often with care. This raises unsettling questions. Did survivors treat their dead with tenderness after yet another raid? Were these burials acts of grief, of memory, perhaps even of solidarity in the face of repeated attack? If so, then Jebel Sahaba records not only violence but resilience. The hardest thing to confront is the ordinariness of it. To us, the embedded flint point in a child's ribcage feels shocking. To them, it may have been familiar. Imagine a world where growing up meant not only learning to fish and forage, but also carrying scars from arrows shot at your camp, where every meeting with strangers by the river's edge could end in blood, where burial grounds filled not with the old who had lived full lives, but with the young whose lives had been cut short. What do we call that? Some have described Jebel Sahaba as the world's earliest evidence of warfare. Others hesitate, preferring to call it chronic raiding or endemic conflict. Perhaps the labels are less important than the recognition that here, for one of the first times in the archaeological record, violence was not accidental or isolated. It was structured into existence. And yet, as with all deep prehistory, caution is required. We cannot know the attacker's motives, nor whether the victims themselves were also aggressors in other times and places. We cannot hear their stories of why the raids happened, what grudges or rivalries shaped them, or how they rationalised killing. All we have are bones with scars, mute but eloquent, telling us that violence was part of their life world. So, was this the first battlefield grave? The evidence suggests yes, at least in the sense of a burial ground where repeated violent encounters left a population scarred and diminished. But it was also a place of community, where the living still gathered to mourn and to remember. Jebel Sahaba is both a battlefield and a cemetery. It is where the origins of organised human conflict are written not in words, but in stone points lodged in ancient ribs. And perhaps the most haunting question is not whether Jebel Sahaba marks the first battlefield, but whether it also marks the first time a community carried violence inside itself as memory, as identity, as something woven into daily survival. If so, then the line between the past and us today is thinner than we might wish. What makes humans kill entire families? It is one thing to imagine skirmishes among young men over hunting grounds or stolen resources, but it is something else to uncover the remains of a massacre where no one was spared. Not the children, not the elders, not even the unborn. At Naturuk in western Kenya 10,000 years ago, violence reached a level that feels chillingly modern, the annihilation of a whole community, as if the goal was not just to win a fight but to erase a lineage. Naturuk lies near what was once a lagoon at the edge of Lake Turkana. Today it is an arid and unforgiving place, but at the close of the Pleistocene and dawn of the Holocene, this region held rich resources. Fresh water, fish, fertile reeds, and grazing for game animals all converged there. It was the sort of place that could sustain groups of hunter-gatherers in abundance, but also the sort of place that others might covet. Archaeologists excavating the site in the 2010s found something that should have been impossible. Not a cemetery, not deliberate burials, but scattered skeletons of at least 27 individuals who had died violently and been left where they fell. The bodies bear unmistakable signs of massacre. Many skulls are fractured by blunt force blows. Several skeletons show obsidian bladelets embedded in bone. Some individuals had their hands bound behind their backs, as if taken prisoner and executed. One of the most harrowing finds was the skeleton of a pregnant woman, lying on her side with her hands still clasped, her abdomen containing the remains of a near-term fetus. This was not a raid aimed at capturing resources or driving away rivals. It was the destruction of an entire community, root and branch. What can explain such cruelty among people who were still foragers, not farmers, still moving with the seasons rather than planting crops or building permanent towns? One interpretation is that Nataruk was the result of a raid for resources at a time when climate instability made survival precarious. As the world warmed after the Ice Age, rainfall patterns in East Africa shifted, lakes expanded and contracted, and groups may have clashed when shorelines or wetlands changed, forcing them into closer proximity. In this reading, the attackers were outsiders who saw the Nataruk Lagoon as too valuable to leave in another group's hands, but the detail suggests something even darker. The fact that women of childbearing age are underrepresented among the skeletons points to the likelihood of abduction. If attackers seized the young women and killed everyone else, then this was not just violence for resources, but violence aimed at genetic capture, ensuring the attacker's bloodline carried on while extinguishing the victims. It is chilling to think that long before written history, human groups may have practiced tactics of conquest that echo what we later call ethnic cleansing. Nataruk forces us to confront a difficult truth. Organised mass violence does not begin with agriculture or with states. It does not require cities, kings, or armies. Here, 10,000 years ago, in a lagoon surrounded by reeds and fish, hunter-gatherers committed acts of brutality we might otherwise ascribe to empires. This makes Nataruk unique among prehistoric sites, because unlike Jebel Sahaba, which shows repeated raids over generations, Nataruk appears to capture one single event, a massacre frozen in time, bodies left unburied, as if erasure was the point. It is easy to recoil and call the perpetrators monsters, but in doing so we risk missing the broader lesson. The people who committed this act were anatomically and cognitively the same as us. They could have sung, joked and loved in ways we might recognise, and yet under conditions of fear, scarcity or rivalry, they turned to slaughter. What this shows is not that humanity is condemned to violence, but that the capacity for it lies deep, ready to emerge under certain pressures. Archaeologists still debate whether Nataruk represents a unique tragedy, or the tip of a larger pattern of group conflict among late hunter-gatherers. Some argue that it reflects the beginnings of territorial defence, the moment when resources became fixed enough in place that eliminating rivals paid off. Others caution against reading too much into one site, noting that in most hunter-gatherer contexts, skeletal trauma from violence remains relatively rare. What we can say is that here, in the silt of a lagoon, we have the oldest clear archaeological evidence of a massacre, where the victims include bound captives, women, children, and even the unborn. Perhaps the most haunting thing about Nataruk is that it shows how early humans understood the logic of extermination. To kill an enemy in battle is one thing. To kill his child, his partner, his unborn descendant is to erase him entirely. 10,000 years ago, that logic had already appeared. So what makes humans kill entire families? At Nataruk, the evidence points to fear, desire, and calculation, the same tangled motives that drive violence today. And in the silence of those skeletons, we are left with a question that unsettles more than it answers. If even small groups of foragers could annihilate one another at this scale, what does that say about the fragility of peace in larger, more complex societies? To place Nataruk in context, we must also consider the land and waters that shaped the choices of its people. 10,000 years ago, the East African Rift Valley was a place of restless change. The Great Lakes expanded during wetter pulses, only to retreat dramatically during dry swings. At times, the lagoon at Nataruk may have been abundant with fish and bird life. At others, it may have shrunk into a muddy basin. In this volatile setting, even a minor shift in shoreline could turn abundance into scarcity, forcing groups into direct confrontation. For hunter-gatherers, Survival hinged not just on finding food, but on predicting where food would appear next. A lagoon rich with reeds and fish could act like a magnet, drawing families from surrounding areas who hoped to claim its bounty. If one group had already established itself there, another arriving clan faced a decision: negotiate, share, or fight. The remains at Nataruk suggest that, at least on that occasion, the decision was made in favour of bloodshed. Yet even here, ambiguity lingers. Some scholars wonder whether Nataruk might have been a travelling group caught off guard rather than a settled community defending its home. Perhaps they had paused near the lagoon on a seasonal trek, only to be ambushed by a rival party. In that scenario, the massacre would not mark territorial defence so much as opportunistic raiding, a calculated attempt to seize women, weapons and food, while ensuring no survivors remained to retaliate. The tools tell part of the story. Obsidian flakes embedded in bone point to attackers armed with material not locally available, suggesting long-distance movement. This raises the possibility that the aggressors had travelled some distance before striking, maybe drawn by rumours of the lagoon's richness, or by previous encounters with the group they destroyed. The use of exotic obsidian also highlights how even in deep prehistory, human networks stretched across landscapes, carrying both goods and rivalries with them. Nataruk is also important because it resists easy categorization. Unlike later sites with formal burials, here the dead were left exposed, scattered in the silts of the lagoon. That decision, or indifference, tells us something about intent. By refusing burial, the killers denied their victims dignity. They left bodies where they fell, to be consumed by scavengers or swallowed by mud. It was not only a practical act of violence, but a symbolic one, a denial of humanity itself. In this way, Nataruk foreshadows patterns that recur throughout history. The use of violence not just to defeat, but to humiliate, to deny memory, to erase. The lagoon preserves the physical evidence, but the silence that surrounds it leaves us with questions that feel as relevant now as they did then. Was this massacre an anomaly born of desperate times, or was it a glimpse into a recurring thread of human behaviour that has accompanied us ever since? Why do broken bones fill these ditches? The early farmers of Europe left behind not only houses, pots and fields, but also something far darker. Communal graves in which every skeleton tells a story of violence. For a long time, it was tempting to imagine the first villages as havens of stability, people finally freed from the unpredictability of hunting and gathering. But when archaeologists uncovered pits full of shattered skulls, cut bones, and bodies thrown in without order, the idea of peaceful beginnings collapsed. Farming gave more food, but it also gave reasons to fight. And some of the first clear evidence of organised killings comes from these early Neolithic societies. Let us begin in what is now southwest Germany, in a small site near a place called Talheim. It was discovered in the 1980s when a gravel pit was opened. What lay beneath shocked archaeologists. A single long ditch held the remains of more than 30 people. These were not carefully arranged burials. The bodies were piled haphazardly, without the ritual care usually seen in Neolithic graves. Men, women, and children lay together, many with the same haunting injury, a crushing blow to the head delivered by stone axes of the type their neighbours carried. Some skeletons had multiple strikes, as if to ensure death. Many showed no signs of defence wounds on arms or hands, suggesting they had been overwhelmed rather than engaged in battle. Talheim became known as the site of the death pit. Genetic studies later suggested that the people buried there were members of one community, not outsiders. This meant the massacre was not the result of disease or accident, but of deliberate killing. The attackers may have been neighbouring farmers or rival clans who sought to seize land, cattle, or even women. Some interpretations propose that Talheim shows the fate of a group that refused to merge with another or resisted domination. Others suggest simple resource stress. But the evidence of trauma is unambiguous. These people were executed systematically, their community erased in a single event. If Talheim was shocking, it was not unique. About 100 kilometres to the north, at Schöneck-Kilienstetten, another ditch revealed a scene of a horror dating to around 7,000 years ago. Here archaeologists uncovered the remains of more than 24 individuals, most with shattered skulls and broken legs. What makes this site especially disturbing is the systematic breaking of shin bones, apparently inflicted at the time of death or immediately after. The fractures were not caused by accidental collapse or post-burial disturbance. They were deliberate. Theories suggest that the attackers intended to disable their victims in a cruel display, perhaps as punishment, or as a ritual humiliation to make sure the dead could never walk again, in life or in spirit. At Schöneck-Kilienstetten too, the victims were not only men of fighting age. Women and children were among the dead, reminding us that these were not battles between equal warriors, but raids targeting entire communities. The violence had a calculated purpose: elimination. Early farmers invested enormous labour in clearing fields, building longhouses and tending crops. Unlike hunter-gatherers, they could not simply move away when conflict arose. Their land was fixed, their investment permanent, and so when rival groups collided, the result was often annihilation rather than retreat. Another site, Herxheim in southwest Germany, pushes the evidence into even stranger territory. Discovered in the early 2000s, Herxheim contained the remains of more than 500 individuals deposited in elongated pits surrounding a settlement. But unlike Talheim or Schöneck, the bones here bore signs of careful processing. Many skulls had been smashed open, long bones broken to extract marrow, and in some cases skull caps shaped into bowls. The bones were mixed with pottery from as far away as France and Switzerland, suggesting that people had brought the dead here from distant places. What happened at Herxheim remains debated. Some archaeologists see it as a site of ritual cannibalism, where victims were not only killed but consumed as part of ceremonies. Others argue that the dismemberment may have been symbolic, the bones treated as offerings rather than food. Whatever the truth, Herxheim shows that the early Neolithic world was not simply a patchwork of quiet villages, but one of violent rituals and organised killings. When we step back, a pattern begins to emerge. From around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, across Central Europe, communities were vulnerable to sudden violent ends. These were the centuries of the linear pottery culture, the first farming society to spread through much of Europe. They built longhouses, farmed wheat and barley, and kept cattle. They dug ditches and sometimes built palisades. They also lived with the constant possibility of attack. Archaeologists estimate that a significant proportion of known sites show signs of violence, whether in the form of mass graves, destroyed settlements, or defensive structures. One reason for this may have been simple population growth. Farming allowed more people to live in one place, but it also meant more mouths to feed. Land that had been forest or meadow was cleared and cultivated. Boundaries mattered. A few hundred metres of fertile ground could mean survival or famine. Unlike mobile foragers, farmers could not easily share or move. Land disputes became life and death struggles. Another factor was the nature of inheritance. When land and herds became property, competition sharpened. Leaders who controlled resources had power, and ambitious rivals had motive to seize them. Violence was not random but systemic, woven into the social fabric of early farming life. The skulls at Talheim and Schöneck tell us that children were not spared, suggesting that the intent was not to win a skirmish but to erase entire bloodlines. It is tempting to see in these sites the birth of war. Yet we should be cautious. We cannot know whether the attackers saw themselves as conducting warfare in any organised sense. They may not have thought in terms of armies or campaigns. Instead, what we see could be repeated raids, fueled by revenge, scarcity, or cycles of retaliation. But when the result was entire families slaughtered, the distinction between raid and war becomes thin. Herxheim adds another unsettling possibility, that violence was not only practical but also ritualised. The processing of bones, the mingling of pottery from distant places, the creation of skull cups, these suggest acts embedded in belief systems we can barely guess at. Were the dead enemies consumed as a way of absorbing their strength, or were they sacrificed willingly in rituals that bound communities together? The ambiguity is part of the power of these sites. They force us to admit that the roots of human violence are entangled with culture, ritual and meaning, not just hunger or fear. These mass graves also remind us that violence leaves a stronger mark on history than peace. For every Talheim, There may have been dozens of villages where neighbours coexisted in uneasy calm. Wooden houses and fences rot away, but broken skulls endure. Our image of the past is inevitably shaped by what survives. Still, the concentration of violent sites in Neolithic Europe is hard to dismiss as coincidence. Something about these first farmers made them both builders of communities and destroyers of them. We may never know the individual stories of those who lived and died in Talheim or Schöneck, but their bones confront us with the reality that the move to farming was not only about bread and beer, but also about boundaries and blood. The very act of settling down may have given birth to the idea that some land, some people, and some futures must be destroyed for others to survive. And so we circle back to the haunting question: did agriculture civilize us, or did it give us new and terrifying reasons to kill? What story does Ötzi's arrow wound really tell? For most of human history, bodies decayed quickly, and stories of conflict vanished with them. But 5,000 years ago in the icy Alps, one man's final moments were preserved with an almost forensic precision that still astonishes us today. His body, later called the Iceman, emerged from melting glacier ice in 1991. It is among the most intimate glimpses we have into the violence of prehistory, because Ötzi carries not only his tools and clothes, but also the wounds of his last fight. He is not a myth or a legend. He is a corpse, and in his frozen skin and bones we can trace the shadow of a killing. At first, Ötzi looked like a tragic accident victim. He lay face down, half embedded in the ice, his skin browned by centuries, his limbs twisted as if he had fallen and never risen. For months, researchers assumed he had been a traveller lost in snow, overcome by cold. Only later, with CT scans and closer study, did the true story emerge. A small flint arrowhead was lodged deep in his left shoulder, severing a major artery. He had bled to death high in the mountains. The glacier had then sealed his body in ice, preserving it through millennia. This was not an accident. This was a killing. The more scientists studied, the more tangled the mystery became. Ötzi was not unarmed or unskilled. He carried a finely crafted copper axe, a bow and quiver of arrows, and flint knives. He wore a coat stitched from goat and deer hides, leggings of goat leather, a grass cloak, and a bearskin hat. He had shoes padded with hay for insulation. He was equipped for survival, but his death came not from weather or starvation, but from another human being. What makes Ötzi's case haunting is not only the arrow wound, but the context. Analysis of his clothing and tools suggests he came from a farming community in the valleys below. Stable isotope studies of his teeth and bones show where he grew up, drank water, and lived in his later years. His tattoos, over 60 lines and crosses cut into his skin and rubbed with charcoal, hint at pain relief treatments or symbolic marks. But his last days were marked by conflict. His right hand bore a deep cut, almost certainly from a defensive wound, inflicted 1 or 2 days before his death. His ribs and face showed bruises from blows. He had been in a fight. He had survived it. And then, in the mountains, someone finished the job. Blood analysis adds another layer. Traces of 4 different human blood types were found on his belongings. On one arrow there was blood from a red deer, suggesting a recent hunt. On another, the blood of a man. His cloak carried blood from 2 individuals. One theory is that Ötzi was part of a skirmish, fighting alongside or against multiple men. Perhaps he killed 1 or 2 and carried the marks of their blood on his gear. Perhaps he tended to injured companions. Either way, the evidence makes clear that he was not alone in violence. His death was part of a wider encounter. The angle of the arrow is telling. It entered his back from the left, high and behind the shoulder, in a downward trajectory. It was not the kind of wound made face to face. It was an ambush shot fired from behind and above. Whoever killed him did not challenge him openly. They struck him when his guard was lowered, perhaps as he climbed the slope. And the fact that the arrow shaft had been pulled out, leaving the arrowhead buried, suggests that someone wanted to hide evidence or prevent identification. After the shot, Ötzi likely staggered, bled out, and died within minutes. Why did someone kill him? Here we enter the realm of possibilities, not certainties. Was it a feud within his own community, a dispute over land, cattle, or honour? Was he a fugitive, fleeing revenge? Or was he caught in a raid, ambushed by rivals in a high pass. The copper axe he carried was no ordinary tool. At the time, copper was a precious material, not widely available. It could mark him as a man of high status or unusual connections. Some archaeologists suggest he may have been a local leader, a craftsman, or someone whose possessions made him a target. Others argue the axe was why he was killed, the equivalent of a weapon worth stealing. Yet the axe was left behind. His bow, half finished, was also left behind. His quiver still held arrows. Whoever killed him did not loot his body. This is one of the strangest parts of the case. If robbery had been the motive, the killer would have taken the axe. Instead, they shot him and left his valuable belongings where they fell. Perhaps the killing was about revenge or honour, not wealth. Perhaps leaving the body intact was itself the statement. That his death, not his goods, was the point. Ötzi also shows us something about the scale of violence in early farming societies. Unlike the mass graves of Talheim or Schoneck, here we see an individual, not a massacre. But the intensity is the same. A dispute between men could escalate to lethal force, even in remote mountains. Violence was not reserved for great battles. It could take the form of a personal ambush, a feud carried into the high passes. Forensic science allows us to reconstruct the final moments in remarkable detail. CT scans reveal the path of the arrow. DNA tests identify blood traces. Pollen analysis from his stomach shows the last meal he ate, grain, meat, and herbs, just hours before he died. Even the state of his intestines gives clues to his stress levels. He had parasites, whipworm, and signs of chronic illness. He had worn arthritic joints, evidence of hard labour. His tattoos may have been treatments for pain. He was not a mythic warrior, but a man with sore knees, stomach trouble, and enemies. The ambiguity remains. Was Ötzi's death murder, warfare, or a feud? The distinction blurs in prehistory. A fight over land, a raid, or a personal vendetta could all look the same in bones. What his body does show us is that violence was deeply embedded in the lives of early farming people. He was not the victim of wild beasts or weather, but of another human hand. The arrow in his shoulder is a reminder that 5,000 years ago, high in the Alps, people were already killing each other with skill, intent, and perhaps planning. Ötzi's story also shows how much one body can reveal. Unlike skeletal remains in a mass grave, here we have clothing, tools, tattoos, stomach contents, and wounds together. It is a case study in the complexity of prehistoric violence. Was he hunted like prey? Was he betrayed by his own? We will never know. But his frozen body forces us to confront the fact that even the earliest farmers carried conflict with them into the mountains. And so the haunting question remains. If Ötzi could tell us his story, would he call himself a victim of war, of murder, or of something else entirely? Are chimpanzee ambushes a window into our past? For centuries, humans assumed that violence on the scale of war was unique to our kind, a product of weapons, armies, and civilization. We believed that other animals might fight over food or squabble for mates, but the organized, premeditated, and coalition-based killing of their own kind seemed like a uniquely human affliction. That assumption began to crumble in the second half of the 20th century, when researchers living among chimpanzees observed something shocking. Deliberate, coordinated violence not only within communities but against neighbouring groups. What unfolded in one Tanzanian forest challenged the comfortable boundary we had drawn between ourselves and the other apes. The events are now known as the Gombe-Chimpanzee War, though the term war carries with it a weight borrowed from our own species. It began in the early 1970s, when Jane Goodall and her colleagues had already been observing chimpanzees at Gombe Stream National Park for over a decade. By that time, the chimps were well habituated to human presence, and their social world had been mapped in extraordinary detail. There were dominant males, maternal lines, shifting alliances, and all the subtle dynamics of grooming, sharing, and rivalry that made up daily life. And then, the community split. The break was subtle at first. A small faction of chimpanzees began spending more time in the southern part of the range, while others held to the northern valleys. Over time, the division hardened. What had once been a single social group was now two. The northern faction became known as the Kasakila, the southern as the Kahama, and this fracture set the stage for something unprecedented in the annals of animal behaviour. Beginning in 1974, Casakila males initiated a campaign of deliberate organised raids against their former companions. These were not spontaneous outbursts of aggression, they were ambushes. A party of males, sometimes accompanied by females, would move quietly into Kahama territory, advancing cautiously, listening for signs of their rivals. If they encountered a lone Kahama male, the outcome was brutal. The Kasakala coalition would leap upon him, biting, beating, tearing at his flesh, until he was incapacitated or dead. Then they would vanish, leaving the broken body behind. Over the next 4 years, this pattern repeated. Male after male from the Kahama group was picked off in ambushes. Some attacks left bodies too mutilated to survive. Others drove survivors into hiding. Females were sometimes harassed, beaten, or absorbed into the Kasakila group. But the systematic focus of the raids was the elimination of Kahama males. By 1978, the Kahama community no longer existed. The Kasakila had absorbed their range and females, and their rivals were annihilated. The scale of the violence astonished observers. These were not isolated fights. They were strategic campaigns. The Kasakila males coordinated their movements, waited for opportunities, and attacked only when the odds were overwhelmingly in their favour. No Kasakila male was killed in the process, though a few bore scars. The Kahama, however, were erased as a social unit. For those who had long believed that war was a uniquely human invention, the Gombe War was a revelation. Skeptics at the time raised doubts. Perhaps the provisioning of chimps with bananas had distorted their natural behaviour, encouraging aggression. Perhaps the unusual concentration of chimps in the park had intensified conflict. But over the decades that followed, similar patterns were documented in other chimpanzee populations, free of provisioning, in forests and savannas across Africa. Lethal raiding was not an aberration. It was part of the chimpanzee repertoire. What drives these raids? The simplest explanation is territory. Chimpanzee groups, or communities, defend ranges that provide access to fruiting trees, hunting opportunities, and safe nesting sites. By eliminating neighbouring males, a group can expand its range and secure more resources. Females from the defeated group may also be recruited, increasing reproductive opportunities. In this sense, raiding pays dividends in both food and reproduction. It is not violence for its own sake, but violence as a strategy. This makes the Gombe War all the more unsettling as a mirror for our own species. Here were apes, our closest relatives, demonstrating not only lethal violence, but coalitionary violence. Individuals banding together to achieve what none could accomplish alone. Attacks planned, opportunities exploited, victims dispatched when most vulnerable. These are not accidents of passion. They are coordinated killings, and they look disturbingly like the roots of warfare. The details are grim. In one attack, a young Kahama male was cornered by 5 Kasakila. They pinned him to the ground, bit into his face and genitals, and pounded his body until he no longer moved. Another time, a wounded Kahama male attempted to flee, but was pursued and mauled until death. Goodall herself, writing in her field notes, described the scenes with horror. She admitted that after years of watching the affectionate bonds, playful youngsters, and tender maternal care of chimps, she had not imagined them capable of such cruelty. To see them dismember one another, to see them plan attacks, was a profound shock. Evolutionary biologists seized on the observations. If chimpanzees, without metal weapons or permanent settlements, engaged in lethal raiding, perhaps the roots of human warfare extended far deeper than agricultural states. Perhaps our common ancestor, 6 or 7 million years ago, already possessed the seeds of coalitionary violence. In that view, the organised killing of neighbours is not something humans invented in Mesopotamia, but something inherited from an ape lineage long before. The implications are heavy. It suggests that violence between groups may be an ancient adaptive strategy, rewarded by access to resources and reproductive success. In fact, demographic studies show that male chimpanzees in groups that conduct successful raids gain more territory, more females, and higher reproductive output. Violence, in other words, pays, but we must be cautious. Chimps are not humans, and humans are not chimps. The presence of lethal raiding in chimpanzees does not prove that prehistoric humans behaved in exactly the same way. Ecology matters. Chimpanzees live in forest mosaics with patchy fruit resources. Their fission-fusion social structure creates opportunities for males to travel in raiding parties. Humans, by contrast, developed broader cooperative networks, technologies, and cultural mechanisms that change the calculus. What the Gombe War shows is not that humans are destined to kill, but that the capacity for coalitionary violence exists deep in our primate heritage. Other species rarely display anything comparable. Lions fight over prides, wolves over territories, but few mammals coordinate multi-individual raids with the explicit goal of killing neighbours. In that sense, chimpanzees and humans may be unusual outliers, species in which social bonds can be turned outward in aggression, as well as inward in cooperation. It is a paradox. The same ability to form coalitions which allows for collective hunting, mutual defence and rich social lives can also enable collective violence. As disturbing as the Gombe observations were, they opened new lines of inquiry. Could lethal raiding explain patterns in the archaeological record? Isolated projectile wounds, clusters of trauma, sites like Jebel Sahaba or Nataruk? Could the roots of group violence be traced not to farming or states, but to something much older, embedded in the primate way of life? We cannot answer definitively, but the chimps have shown us that organised killing is not a cultural invention alone. It can emerge from biology, ecology, and social dynamics. Goodall herself, reflecting on the war, wrote of her own sense of betrayal. She had hoped that chimps would serve as a gentler mirror of ourselves, a reminder that our closest relatives were playful, nurturing, and peaceful. Instead, she found them capable of horror, and yet she also noted the complexity. The same chimps who raided and killed were the ones who tenderly cared for infants, shared food, and groomed companions. Violence was part of them, but not all of them. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the Gombe War. Violence and care are not separate categories, belonging to different species. They are intertwined, even in the same individuals. A chimpanzee who grooms his brother one day may join in his killing another. The capacity for both tenderness and brutality lies side by side, and so it is with us. The haunting question remains: if our closest cousins ambush their neighbours for land and mates, then how much of our own history is a continuation of that same dark inheritance? And if coalitionary violence is as ancient as the apes, can it ever be escaped, or only managed? Why do some apes make love instead of war? If chimpanzees show us that coalitionary violence has deep evolutionary roots, bonobos remind us that primate life can follow a very different path. Living just south of the Congo River in Central Africa, bonobos share more than 98% of their DNA with us, just as chimpanzees do. They look similar at first glance, slender and long-limbed, with black hair and expressive eyes. But their societies tell a radically different story about what it means to be an intelligent ape. The most striking fact about bonobos is not their anatomy, but their social order. Whereas chimpanzees are male-dominated, with coalitions of males competing violently for dominance, bonobos are female-centred. Adult females build strong bonds with one another, often reinforced through grooming and most famously through sexual contact. These bonds allow them to collectively dominate males, preventing any single male from ruling by force. A young male's position in the hierarchy depends far more on the status of his mother than on his fighting ability. A high-ranking mother often means a respected son, regardless of his own size or aggression. This flips the chimpanzee world on its head. Bonobos resolve tension in ways that seem almost unthinkable when compared to chimpanzees. Where a chimpanzee might charge, scream, and strike, a bonobo is more likely to engage in sexual behaviour. Encounters between groups that might devolve into battle among chimps often become sexual mingling among bonobos. Females greet one another with genital rubbing. Males engage in face-to-face interactions rarely seen in other primates, and individuals of all ages and sexes use sexual contact to defuse tension, create alliances, and smooth over disputes. To human eyes, it looks startlingly promiscuous, but in evolutionary terms it functions as a social tool. The contrast in violence rates is dramatic. Observational studies have found no confirmed cases of lethal raiding among wild bonobos. Infanticide, common in both chimpanzees and gorillas, is almost entirely absent. While fights do break out, they are typically mild, brief, and resolved quickly without escalation. Compared to chimpanzee societies where as many as 2% of adult deaths are the result of lethal violence, bonobos live in communities where murder appears vanishingly rare. Why this divergence between two species so closely related? Geography is part of the answer. The Congo River forms a natural barrier separating bonobos to the south from chimpanzees to the north. Bonobos inhabit a region where food resources, particularly terrestrial herbs and fruit, are more evenly distributed. This reduces the competition that drives chimpanzee males to fight over access to high-value patches. In the more resource-rich southern forests, bonobos can afford to spend more time together in large, peaceful groups. Ecology shapes society. Another factor is female solidarity. In chimpanzee societies, females are often isolated, ranging alone with their offspring, making it difficult to resist male aggression. In bonobos, females travel together more often, forming coalitions strong enough to check male dominance. A belligerent male who harasses a female may find himself quickly disciplined by several others. This collective enforcement limits bullying and prevents any one male from terrorizing the group. In this way, bonobos show how alliances, not brute force, can structure hierarchy. Yet bonobo life is not a utopia. They are not free from aggression or competition. Males do fight, sometimes violently, over mating opportunities. Females may clash over food or status. But the scale and outcome of these conflicts differ sharply from chimpanzees. Escalation rarely reaches deadly extremes, and reconciliation is swift. Researchers often remark that bonobos are noisy but not deadly, their quarrels punctuated by shrieks and posturing but seldom by bloodshed. For scientists trying to understand human evolution, bonobos present both a puzzle and a hope. If chimpanzees illustrate the dark inheritance of coalitionary violence, bonobos demonstrate that another primate path is possible. Both species are equally close relatives to us, so neither can be dismissed as an outlier. The divergence between them suggests that even within the great ape lineage, social behaviour is flexible, contingent on environment and history. Violence may be deeply rooted, but it is not inevitable. The bonobo example has inspired debates far beyond primatology. Some argue that bonobos show how human societies too might reduce violence through systems that empower cooperation and female alliances. Others caution against romanticizing them, noting that bonobo societies are still hierarchical, competitive, and shaped by ecological conditions that do not mirror our own. What remains undeniable is that bonobos broaden our view of primate possibilities. Their reproductive strategies are also unusual. By using sexual contact so freely, bonobos blur the usual lines of competition. In chimpanzees, dominance often secures exclusive access to females in estrus. In bonobos, sexual availability is far more widespread and less tied to dominance. This diffuses tension, reduces incentive for violent competition, and strengthens group cohesion. Evolutionary biologists sometimes describe bonobo sex as social glue, binding individuals into networks where violence is less rewarding. To watch bonobos is to glimpse a world where social stress leads not to killing but to intimacy. It is a reminder that aggression is not the only ancient tool for resolving disputes. Our lineage carries both potentials, the chimpanzee's raiding party and the bonobo's reconciliation. Which tendencies become dominant depends on conditions, pressures, and choices. Still, bonobos remain fragile. They are endangered, threatened by habitat loss, poaching, and human encroachment. Ironically, the species that seems to embody a gentler primate possibility may be extinguished by ours. Their rarity makes every observation precious, every glimpse of their peaceful interactions a fleeting lesson. If they disappear, we lose not just a species but a living counterpoint to the argument that violence is inevitable. So the haunting question is not just what bonobos tell us about ourselves, but whether we can learn from them before they vanish. They show us that even among apes, even within the same evolutionary family, different paths exist. We are not trapped by biology alone. The roots of war may be deep, but so are the roots of peace, which we nurture as still, in part, a choice. Is violence written into our DNA? It is a question that makes people uneasy. because if the answer is yes, then it seems to rob us of agency. It suggests that every punch thrown in a bar, every battle fought on a field, every war ordered by a leader might not just be history or circumstance, but a whisper carried from molecules inside our cells. And yet, as with most things in biology, the truth is far more complicated, more tangled, and less comfortable than either a simple yes or no. When scientists first began looking for the roots of aggression in human biology, they naturally started with neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers of the brain. Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine all regulate mood, impulse control, and decision-making. Too little serotonin, and individuals may struggle to regulate impulses. Too much dopamine, and risk-taking behaviour may spike. But behind the levels of these chemicals lie the genes that regulate them, shaping how they are produced, how they are broken down, and how they influence neural circuits. One of the most famous of these genes is MAOA, monoamine oxidase A, sometimes nicknamed the warrior gene. It produces an enzyme responsible for breaking down neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. Variants of this gene can alter how active the enzyme is. A low-activity variant leads to slower breakdown of these neurotransmitters, creating higher levels in the brain. At first glance, this might seem beneficial. After all, more serotonin often correlates with stability. But the brain is not so straightforward. In individuals carrying the low-activity MAO variant, studies have found an increased likelihood of impulsive aggression, particularly when coupled with adverse childhood environments such as abuse or neglect. This interaction is critical. Having the gene variant alone does not doom someone to violence. In fact, many carriers live peaceful lives, never showing heightened aggression. It is the interaction of gene and environment that matters, a theme that repeats across the study of human behaviour. In twin studies, where identical and fraternal twins are compared, researchers have found that genetic influence on aggression is measurable but not absolute. Roughly a third of the variation in aggressive behaviour can be attributed to genetics, while the rest arises from environment, upbringing, social context, and chance. The idea of a warrior gene spread quickly into popular culture, often oversimplified into headlines declaring that violence could be predicted by a blood test. Court cases even attempted to use MAOA variants as partial defences, arguing diminished responsibility due to biological predisposition. But science has always been more cautious. Genes create probabilities, not destinies. They tilt the scales slightly, but never write the script. Looking deeper into our evolutionary past, the persistence of aggression-related genes makes sense. A capacity for violence can be adaptive in certain contexts. An individual who defends resources, retaliates against threats, or asserts dominance may leave more descendants. In a world of predators and rivals, aggression was not merely tolerated but sometimes rewarded. But equally, excessive aggression could be disastrous. Someone who fought too readily risked injury, exile, or death. Natural selection then seems to have balanced aggression, not by eliminating it, but by keeping it available, variable, and context-dependent. Beyond MAOA, many other genes have been implicated. Variants in the serotonin transporter gene S, LC6A4, in dopamine receptors such as DRD2 and DRD4, and in genes regulating stress response like COMT, all show associations with aggression in certain populations. But always the same caveat returns. Associations are statistical, not deterministic. Two people can carry the same variant and lead very different lives, one peaceful and one violent. The difference lies in environment, culture, and personal history. The environment in turn can leave its own mark on gene expression through processes known as epigenetics. Stress in early childhood, exposure to violence, malnutrition, and neglect can all alter how genes related to neurotransmitters are expressed. A child raised in a violent household may grow into an adult whose stress response system is hyperreactive, their genes effectively tuned towards vigilance and aggression. Another child, with the same genetic variants but raised in a supportive environment, may never show the same pattern. The story is not only about what genes you inherit, but about how life experiences shape their expression. Animal studies underline this complexity. Mice bred with low levels of MAOA show heightened aggression under stress, but not in all conditions. In peaceful, enriched environments, their aggression does not differ significantly from other mice. Even fruit flies demonstrate similar interactions. Small genetic tweaks can alter aggression, but only in particular environmental contexts. Violence, then, emerges not as a straight line from DNA to behaviour, but as a web of influences, genes and context weaving together into outcomes. This brings us to the haunting question: are humans condemned to carry an aggressive streak because it is etched into our biology? Or can culture, law and cooperation suppress those tendencies? Modern homicide rates suggest that while violence remains, it has declined dramatically over millennia. This suggests that even if our DNA carries the capacity for aggression, social structures and norms can redirect it, channel it, or suppress it. Genes load the dice, but environment rolls them. There is also the uncomfortable matter of interpretation. When we look for genetic correlates of aggression, we must be careful not to confuse cause with correlation, or to use biology as an excuse for behaviour. The history of linking genetics to violence is fraught with misuse, from eugenics movements to simplistic narratives of born criminals. Modern science is more humble. It acknowledges genetic influences, but insists that no single gene can explain the vast spectrum of human violence, from intimate partner abuse to organised warfare. Those phenomena are far more complex, involving economics, politics, identity and culture. If anything, the study of aggression genes highlights our species' plasticity. We carry the potential for violence, encoded in our DNA alongside the potential for empathy, cooperation and creativity. Whether aggression dominates depends not only on genetic predispositions, but on the scaffolding of culture and society that surrounds us. The same biological machinery that can produce violence in one setting can produce resilience, assertiveness, or protection in another. So is violence written into our DNA? In part, yes. But so is the capacity for peace. What the genes show is not that we are doomed, but that we are flexible. We are animals shaped by millions of years of natural selection, but also creatures who invent law codes, write literature, and build institutions to constrain our darker impulses. The genes of aggression whisper, but they do not command. The story of humanity is not whether violence exists in our DNA, it is whether we can continue to choose what we do with it. The story of the warrior gene did not begin in a courtroom or in a tabloid headline. It began quietly, in a long-term research project on the far side of the world. In the early 1970s, a group of scientists in Dunedin, New Zealand began following the lives of just over 1,000 children born in that city. Their goal was simple but ambitious: to track development across a lifetime, combining biological, psychological and social data in a way no one had attempted before. These children were tested regularly, interviewed and observed, their lives documented as they unfolded over decades. No one at the time knew this project would one day shape the way we talk about genes and violence. By the late 1990s, the Dunedin study had gathered a treasure trove of data. It had records not only of health and education, but of adversity. Children who had grown up in stable homes, and children who had endured abuse, neglect, or chaos. When researchers combined this social data with genetic testing, one striking pattern appeared. Boys who carried the low-activity variant of the MAOA gene and who had also suffered abuse in childhood were significantly more likely to show antisocial or violent behaviour as adults. Boys with the same gene but without abuse did not show the same outcome. And boys who had endured abuse but did not carry the low-activity variant fared better too. It was the interaction that mattered. This finding, published in the year 2002, was one of the first clear demonstrations that genes and environment work together in shaping behaviour. It cut against the idea of pure genetic determinism. No one was doomed by their DNA. At the same time, it showed why some children emerge from harsh environments more resilient than others. Genes could tilt the balance, but they only did so in certain contexts. The implications were enormous. On the one hand, it offered a powerful reminder of the importance of childhood environments. If violence in adulthood could be reduced by preventing abuse in childhood, then interventions in early life were not just socially just, but biologically impactful. On the other hand, it raised thorny ethical questions. Should courts consider genetic predispositions when sentencing? Could insurance companies misuse genetic risk factors? Was it dangerous to label a child as biologically at risk of violence? The Dunedin study itself was careful, humble, and cautious. It never claimed to have found a violence gene. It simply showed how one piece of biology, MAOA, could make a difference when life pushed hard enough in the wrong direction. For scientists, the lesson was clear. To understand aggression, you had to look at both strands of the braid, genes and environment twisted together. For the rest of us, perhaps the lesson was even simpler. No one is born violent, but no one is born immune either. Why do males kill the young of their rivals? It is a question that seems too dark to belong in the natural world, a question we would rather leave in the shadows. And yet, when scientists step back and watch, across lions in the savannah, gorillas in the forests, dolphins in the oceans, and sometimes even humans in their own communities, the pattern is too consistent to ignore. Infanticide is not an aberration. It is a recurring strategy, one that echoes in the evolutionary history of many social species. And if we want to understand how violence has shaped us, we cannot look away from this most difficult of truths. In the wide grasslands of Africa, lions live in prides ruled by one or a few dominant males. Their tenure is never secure. Younger coalitions of males, stronger or simply more numerous, will eventually challenge them. When these new males take over a pride, they do something shocking. They kill the cubs sired by the previous males. The logic, if we can call it that, is brutally simple. Female lions will not come into estrus while they are nursing cubs. By eliminating the existing young, the new males reset the reproductive clock. Within weeks, the mothers will be fertile again, and the invaders can father their own offspring. It is not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It is biology, honed by selection. The genes of those who hesitated were left behind. The genes of those who killed spread forward. Something uncannily similar happens among gorillas. A silverback male who controls a harem of females holds a privileged position, but when he dies or is deposed, the new dominant male often kills the infants. The reasoning follows the same line. By ensuring that only his progeny are raised, the new male cements his legacy. Sometimes the mothers try to resist, but a lone female is no match for a powerful silverback. Observers have even seen females carrying the bodies of slain infants for days, a behaviour that speaks to grief but does nothing to alter the logic of selection. The replacement male gains in reproductive terms, and the cycle continues. Even in the water, where we tend to romanticize animals as playful or serene, the story repeats. Dolphins, famous for their intelligence and charisma, have been documented killing the calves of rival males. In some cases, they have been seen ramming or biting a young dolphin to death, again driving the mother back into fertility. For a long time, such reports were dismissed as anomalies, because it was hard to reconcile them with the idea of dolphins as gentle companions of sailors and swimmers. But the evidence is now too consistent. Violence against infants is part of their repertoire, as much as social bonding or cooperative hunting. So what about humans? Did our species inherit this darker pattern? The archaeological record is sparse when it comes to infanticide, partly because infant bones are so fragile and rarely survive. But historical and ethnographic evidence shows that the killing of infants has been practiced in many societies for many reasons. Some of those reasons may seem disturbingly close to the strategies of lions or gorillas. In small-scale societies under severe pressure, a child fathered by a rival may have been seen as a drain on resources or a threat to lineage continuity. There are also records of stepfathers being more likely to kill infants than biological fathers, a trend that fits the evolutionary logic observed in other species. It is uncomfortable to say aloud, but human violence is not disconnected from the broader animal kingdom. Of course, human infanticide has also taken other forms. In some cultures, it was linked not to male reproductive competition, but to resource scarcity, gender preference, or social rules about legitimacy. In ancient Rome, unwanted infants were sometimes exposed on hillsides, left to die, or to be taken in by strangers. In classical Greece, similar practices occurred, often framed as household decisions about inheritance or family balance. In some hunter-gatherer groups recorded by anthropologists, infants born too close together in time might be killed because the mother could not feed two at once. These practices do not map neatly onto lion prides or dolphin pods, but they remind us that humans too have turned on their own young. So why does infanticide emerge again and again? Evolutionary biologists argue that it is a grimly effective strategy under certain conditions. If the survival of one's genes is the ultimate currency, then eliminating rivals' offspring is a way of tipping the balance. For social animals where males compete for access to females, and where offspring require extended parental care, the temptation to shortcut the system by killing is strong. Those who carried the inclination passed it on. Those who refrained left fewer descendants. But biology is not destiny. In many cases, infanticide is countered by counter-strategies. In lion prides, females sometimes band together to defend their cubs. Among gorillas, females may transfer between groups to reduce the risk. In dolphins, alliances of males compete not only by aggression, but by forming coalitions, diluting the incentive for any one male to kill. And in humans, cultural rules, moral codes, and laws have long worked to suppress infanticide. In fact, one of the striking differences between humans and other animals is the degree to which we have built systems to protect the vulnerable. The very horror we feel when we hear of infant killing is itself part of the story. It shows how deeply other instincts, nurturing, empathy, kinship, run in our species. The ambiguity, though, never disappears. Anthropologists who study infanticide in humans often stress that it is not uniform. Rates vary wildly across cultures and eras. In some communities it was rare or absent, in others it was common. This variability suggests that while the capacity may exist in our evolutionary toolkit, it is strongly shaped by environment and culture. In times of scarcity or upheaval, the darker strategies emerge. In times of stability, they fade into the background. The archaeological record occasionally offers a glimpse. In some prehistoric cemeteries, infants appear to have been buried in unusual ratios, suggesting selective survival. In other sites, trauma marks hint at deliberate killing, though it is often difficult to separate accident from intent. What we can say with more confidence is that humans, like other primates, carry both the urge to protect and the urge to destroy, and which one dominates depends on circumstances far larger than any one family. The question that lingers is this: did infanticide leave a lasting mark on human evolution? Some researchers suggest it did. If male infanticide was once common, it may have driven females to evolve counter-strategies. Hidden ovulation, for example, could make it harder for males to know which infants were theirs. Extended social networks, where multiple males invested in a group, could dilute the risk. And perhaps the very structure of human families, where cooperation between parents and kin is so central, arose in part as a defence against the vulnerability of children. In this sense, the shadow of infanticide may be written into the very fabric of our social lives, not just our nightmares. The broader lesson, as always, is not that violence defines us, but that it is one thread in a tangled braid. To ignore it would be dishonest, but to exaggerate it would be equally misleading. Humans are capable of tenderness and care that far outstrips what we see in lions or dolphins. Yet the echoes remain. When we ask why males kill the young of their rivals, we are really asking how far the logic of reproduction has shaped us, and how much we have managed to rise above it. And that is a question that does not end with lions in the savannah or gorillas in the forest. It follows us into the deepest chambers of our own history. Did humans tame themselves? It sounds almost absurd at first hearing. Domestication, after all, is something we usually imagine humans doing to other creatures. Wolves softened into dogs, wild cattle reshaped into docile herds, wild grasses coaxed into wheat. To apply that same idea to ourselves feels like a trick of language. And yet, in recent decades, anthropologists and evolutionary biologists have begun to take the idea seriously. They call it the self-domestication hypothesis, and it suggests that part of what made Homo sapiens unusual was not only our ability to cooperate, but our ability to suppress those among us who could not. The concept rests on a contrast. Look at the difference between a wolf and a dog. Dogs tend to have smaller faces, less pronounced jaws, more playful and juvenile behaviours that persist into adulthood. Wolves are more reactive, prone to aggression when startled or challenged. Domestication shifts the balance. It does not erase aggression entirely, but it reduces the hair trigger response. Many biologists call this reduction in reactive aggression the hallmark of domestication. The self-domestication hypothesis suggests that something similar happened to humans beginning perhaps 200,000 years ago, deep in our evolutionary past. The theory begins with language. Imagine a small band of early humans, not much different from their archaic cousins. Within that group there is one individual who bullies, who lashes out with violence whenever his dominance is questioned. In a purely physical contest, he might maintain his power. But what if the others can speak to one another, can conspire, can share grievances around the fire? Suddenly the bully faces not a single rival, but a coalition. And when that coalition decides that enough is enough, the bully does not last long. Anthropologists call this dynamic a reverse dominance hierarchy. Unlike a troop of chimpanzees, where the most violent alpha may hold on to power by sheer force, humans could bring together words, whispers, and plans. Coalitions mattered more than muscles. Over time, this dynamic may have reshaped our species. Those who could not control their tempers, who resorted to constant violence, were at greater risk of being exiled, executed, or simply ignored. Those who could cooperate, who could laugh, who could smooth conflicts with words, survived and passed on their traits. The result, over tens of thousands of years, may have been a slow but steady selection against reactive aggression. In other words, we became less wolf-like, more dog-like. We tamed ourselves. There is some evidence for this idea in our very anatomy. Compared with Neanderthals and earlier hominins, modern humans have smaller brow ridges, more delicate facial bones, and overall cranial features that resemble what biologists would call neotenous traits, features that look more like juveniles than adults of related species. Our faces are shorter, our jaws reduced, our teeth smaller. These changes parallel what happens in domesticated animals. Foxes bred in Russian experiments to be tamer developed floppy ears, shorter muzzles, and more playful behaviour. Humans show no floppy ears, of course, but the broad trend is suggestive. It is as if the path of least resistance was not toward fiercer warriors, but toward subtler diplomats. But how could such a process sustain itself? Part of the answer may lie in execution. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm, who spent years studying hunter-gatherer groups, documented how bands would quietly coordinate to remove an overbearing member. Sometimes this meant ostracism, sometimes it meant assassination. The group would plan together and strike when the bully least expected it. Boehm argued that this was not just occasional justice, but a system that shaped human evolution. By keeping potential alphas in check, by refusing to let any one individual dominate by sheer violence, humans created a new kind of society. The most aggressive males were no longer rewarded. They were eliminated. This, in turn, may have fostered an entirely new suite of traits. With reactive aggression reduced, cooperation became easier. Shared child-rearing, food-sharing, and ritual could flourish without constant fear of violent outbursts. Over generations, individuals with calmer temperaments, more tolerance, and stronger bonds may have prospered. The very things that seem to make us human — extended childhood, complex cooperation, cultural learning — may have been possible only because we first turned the knife inward against those who could not control themselves. Of course, this is a hypothesis, not settled fact. Critics point out that human history is hardly free of violence. If we truly selected against aggression, why do wars and murders persist? The self-domestication theory does not claim that humans became saints. Instead, it suggests that we became less reactive. The distinction is subtle but important. A wolf startled may lash out without thought. A dog startled may pause, wag its tail, or wait for a command. Humans, by analogy, may have learned to suppress the immediate blow in favour of long-term strategies. Violence did not vanish. It became more calculated, more strategic, sometimes more terrifying in its scale. But the hair-trigger reactions diminished. That, at least, is the claim. Genetic evidence offers a few hints. Certain genes linked to neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine appear to have shifted in humans compared with Neanderthals. Some researchers have argued that selection for prosocial behaviours left fingerprints in our genomes, though the details remain contested. What seems clearer is that the suite of traits we call domestication syndrome — reduced facial robusticity, extended juvenile traits, playful curiosity — fits us as much as it fits the animals we have bred. Another clue lies in our voices. Some anthropologists suggest that the shortening of the human face, part of this domestication trend, altered our vocal tract. That change may have enabled a wider range of sounds, making complex language possible. If so, then language both triggered and was amplified by self-domestication, creating a feedback loop. More speech enabled more coalitions selected against violent alphas, reduced aggression reshaped faces enabled clearer speech. Round and round it went, until we arrived at something recognisably human. The consequences reach even further. Consider our tolerance of strangers. For much of the animal world, encountering an unfamiliar adult is a recipe for aggression. For humans, the reaction is often curiosity or negotiation. This openness to strangers may have been another product of self-domestication. In small groups, it allowed intermarriage, trade, and alliance. At aggregation sites tens of thousands of years ago, when bands met and exchanged goods and genes, the ability to withhold aggression was vital. Without it, contact would have dissolved into bloodshed every time. With it, culture could spread, innovations could move, and populations could expand. Yet the haunting question remains: did humans truly tame themselves, or are we simply reading back our own metaphors? When we call ourselves domesticated, we risk implying that some gardener's hand shaped us. But no one stood above humanity to cull the violent and reward the meek. It was our own groups, our own coalitions, our own whispered agreements that did the work. In that sense, the idea is humbling. We did not transcend our animal past by sheer genius or by divine spark. We did it by quietly conspiring to take down the bullies. Still, the theory has gaps. Not every human society punishes aggressors with equal zeal. In some settings, violent individuals still rise to power. History shows us empires ruled by conquerors, tyrants, and warlords. Self-domestication may have set the baseline, but cultural variation layered on top can tilt the balance back and forth. This is why the hypothesis remains debated. Did evolution really prune our species in this way, or did culture alone do the heavy lifting? The fossil record can hint, genetics can whisper, but no one can yet prove it. What is undeniable is that humans occupy a peculiar middle ground. We are not the most violent primates, but we are far from the gentlest. We live in societies where cooperation and trust can scale to millions, but also in societies where those same millions can be mobilized for war. To call this paradox self-domestication is to remind ourselves that the taming, if it happened, was always fragile, always partial. We may have turned down the volume on reactive aggression, but we did not erase the song entirely. So did humans tame themselves? Perhaps the better question is, did we create the conditions where those who could not control their violence fell away, leaving behind a slightly calmer, slightly more sociable version of ourselves? If that is true, then the foundations of everything we call civilization rest not only on stone tools and fire, but on whispers in the dark, on coalitions against the bullies, on the quiet courage to stand together and say, enough. And perhaps the haunting question to end on is this: if we once managed to tame ourselves, can we do it again, in the face of the new forms of violence we have invented? Are we beasts by nature or corrupted angels? This is one of those questions that refuses to die, resurfacing again and again across centuries of human thought. Every time violence surges in the world, it feels urgent. Every time peace seems possible, it feels naive. And when bones and stones from the deep past confront us with evidence of both brutality and care, we search for frameworks to interpret what we see. Long before archaeologists dug through mass graves, or anthropologists watched chimpanzees ambush each other in the forest, philosophers grappled with the puzzle of whether violence is innate to humans or the product of circumstance. In the writings of Aristotle in the 4th century BCE, we find one of the earliest systematic attempts to think about human nature in this regard. Aristotle described humans as political animals, beings who are meant to live in communities, who achieve their fullest lives not in isolation but in the polis, the structured city-state. For him, violence was not the essence of humanity. Rather, the capacity for reason and speech, the ability to deliberate about justice and injustice, distinguished us from other animals. But Aristotle was no utopian. He recognised that war, conflict and domination were constant features of his world. His philosophy held both that humans are naturally social and that this very sociability creates rivalries, hierarchies, and struggles over power. In this sense, Aristotle seeded a paradox that we still wrestle with. Our capacity for living together is both our greatest strength and the source of our most bitter fights. Several centuries later, far from Greece, Confucian thinkers in China reflected on similar questions. For Confucius, who lived in the 6th to 5th century BCE, human beings were fundamentally capable of goodness, but this potential needed cultivation. Proper conduct, ritual, and education were the means by which people learned to live in harmony. Violence arose not from nature itself, but from the failure to uphold the bonds of respect and duty. His vision was echoed in the Analects, which stress kindness, filial piety, and the responsibility of rulers to govern with virtue. The implication was that when societies descend into cruelty, it is not because humans are doomed to violence, but because leaders fail to nurture the moral character of their people. This line of thought later influenced Chinese legalists and moral philosophers, who debated whether humanity leans naturally toward order or chaos. The Confucian tradition is significant because it offers a counterweight to the more cynical traditions that would dominate European political thought millennia later. For Confucians, we are not beasts, but beings who stumble when not guided by proper structures of culture and family. The darkness in human affairs comes from neglect, not inevitability. When we leap forward to early modern Europe, the tone becomes darker. In the 17th century, the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, writing in the shadow of civil war, offered one of the most influential and bleakest accounts of human violence. In his book Leviathan, 1651, Hobbes argued that in the state of nature, before the establishment of governments, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Without an overarching authority to enforce order, humans would exist in a perpetual war of all against all, driven by fear and competition. In this view, violence was the baseline, the natural state of humanity. Peace was an artificial achievement, secured only when people collectively submitted to a sovereign power strong enough to suppress their aggression. For Hobbes, then, humans were indeed beasts by nature, and only the chains of political order could make us safe. Yet not everyone agreed. In the 18th century, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau painted a very different picture. For Rousseau, humans in their natural state were not brutes but peaceful wanderers, guided by compassion and the simple need to survive. Violence, he argued, became common only with the advent of private property and social inequality. Civilization itself was the corrupter, teaching people to compare themselves with others, to envy, to dominate, and to hoard. If Hobbes believed we were violent by nature and saved by society, Rousseau believed we were peaceful by nature and corrupted by society. Both men saw violence as central to the human condition, but they placed its roots in opposite places. The debate between Hobbes and Rousseau is not just a historical curiosity. It continues to haunt how we interpret evidence of early violence. When archaeologists uncover skeletons pierced with arrowheads, are we seeing confirmation of Hobbes, that life before the state was indeed a brutal war of all against all? Or are we seeing the exceptional breakdown of Rousseau's natural compassion under specific pressures, like famine or competition for resources? Every bone fragment can be read through either lens, and our interpretations often reflect our philosophical priors more than the silent evidence itself. In between Hobbes's cynicism and Rousseau's romanticism lies a spectrum of thinkers who tried to balance both views. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, for instance, acknowledged human self-interest, but also emphasised our natural capacity for sympathy. He believed that both selfishness and compassion were part of our nature, and that social institutions could amplify one or the other. Similarly, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that humans carried both unsocial sociability and a rational drive toward peace. For Kant, the violent conflicts of nations might paradoxically push humanity toward a cosmopolitan order, where reason eventually tames aggression. These frameworks, though centuries old, remain remarkably relevant. When we look back at the violence of the Paleolithic or Neolithic, we're really asking whether Hobbes or Rousseau was right. Were our ancestors already engaged in endemic violence, confirming the Hobbesian nightmare? Or were they mostly peaceful until social complexity and inequality corrupted them, proving Rousseau's lament? The bones cannot settle the question, but the fact that philosophers asked it long before those bones were unearthed shows how deeply the puzzle runs. There is also the question of whether violence is primarily an individual failing or a collective one. Aristotle and Confucius put the burden on society. Good leadership, good education, and good structures could harness human potential and restrain cruelty. Hobbes put the burden on authority. Only an overwhelming sovereign could keep our natural violence in check. Rousseau put the burden on civilization itself. Remove inequality, and the corruption of our gentle nature might dissolve. Each of these views offers a different lens for modern readers to interpret both history and the present. What unites them, perhaps, is humility in the face of contradiction. Even Hobbes, for all his bleakness, recognized that humans had the capacity to reason their way into collective agreements. Even Rousseau, for all his optimism, recognized that society could nurture virtue as well as corruption. The oscillation between beast and angel is not easily resolved. It is the unresolved tension itself that makes the question so enduring. And so we find ourselves, centuries later, with archaeological digs, genetic data, and primate studies in hand, still circling the same problem. Were we violent by nature, or did violence creep in through culture? The philosophers of violence remind us that this is not only a scientific puzzle but a moral one. How we answer shapes not just our view of the past but our hopes for the future. If we are beasts by nature, then perhaps only strict control and authority can restrain us. If we are corrupted angels, then perhaps reforming society can restore peace. If we are both, caught in tension, then perhaps vigilance is the only answer. The haunting question remains: when we look at a fractured skull from thousands of years ago, are we looking at inevitability or at a mistake? Do bones show us a fall in violence over time? It is a tempting question because, unlike speculation about motives or philosophies, bones can be counted. A fractured skull does not lie. A rib pierced by a flint point does not disguise what happened. And when archaeologists carefully record the frequency of such injuries across different eras, a surprising picture begins to emerge. For all the horror of our written history with its empires and invasions, the story told by prehistoric skeletons suggests that the most dangerous time to be alive may have been before the rise of cities, before kings, before armies, when people still lived in small bands and early villages. Evidence from the Mesolithic period, roughly 10 to 7,000 years ago in many parts of Europe, suggests astonishingly high levels of lethal violence. At certain sites, as many as 15% of the recovered skeletons show signs of violent death. That means that nearly 1 in 7 people carried fatal trauma from weapons or blunt blows. Some had arrowheads still lodged in their bones. Others had skulls crushed by clubs or axes. Entire cemeteries bear the mark of conflict, sometimes with men, women and children all represented among the dead. It is an arresting contrast. Groups too small to field armies nonetheless managed to inflict death on their neighbours at levels that dwarf those of later centuries. Why would violence be so common in a world with so few people? One explanation is that in sparse populations, each group's access to territory and resources was fragile. A lagoon teeming with fish, a valley with good game, a riverbank suited to seasonal campfires. Such places would have been both obvious and limited. Without fixed states to mediate disputes, quarrels could escalate into raids, raids into reprisals, reprisals into running feuds. The Mesolithic evidence suggests that violence was not merely accidental but structured, with signs of repeated assaults across generations. Some anthropologists argue that this was the closest humans came to Hobbes's famous war of all against all. Yet as societies shifted toward agriculture, something remarkable happened. By the time large villages and early urban centres emerged in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, the relative proportion of violent deaths seems to decline. To be clear, violence did not vanish. There are still massacres, individual murders, and skeletal trauma. But in many surveyed populations, the percentage of people who died violently fell below the Mesolithic peak. In some areas it dropped to levels closer to 2 or 3%. On a proportional scale, this is a dramatic reduction. How can it be that bigger societies, with more people to fight over more resources, sometimes turned out to be safer than the smaller ones that came before? One answer is that the invention of new forms of authority, chiefdoms, councils, early monarchies, created ways of resolving disputes short of lethal force. Another is that settled farming produced surpluses, which made starvation less constant and reduced the desperate edge that can drive raids. And still another is that permanent villages tied people to specific places, which in turn encouraged negotiated boundaries rather than perpetual roving skirmishes. In this sense, the birth of organised society may have been the first large-scale peace project in human history. Of course, this does not mean that Neolithic and Bronze Age life was peaceful in the modern sense. Archaeologists still uncover mass graves that testify to episodes of extraordinary violence. The difference is one of proportion. In a Mesolithic band of 100 people, 15 deaths from violence in a generation could wipe out kin lines. In a Bronze Age settlement of several thousand, even an equally bloody raid would leave a smaller percentage of the total community dead. Statistics are cold comfort, but they suggest that ordinary life may have been less constantly shadowed by the threat of murder once larger societies formed. There is also the question of visibility. In small foraging groups, the violence was often face-to-face, arrow to bone, club to skull. In later societies, violence could become more abstract, organised through armies, inflicted on strangers, hidden in the destruction of villages recorded only in ashes. This shift complicates the archaeological record. A burned settlement might mean a raid, but without skeletons left behind it does not enter our percentages. So the apparent decline in violence may partly reflect a change in what leaves traces. Still, the contrast between cemeteries filled with pierced bones and later ones with far fewer such injuries is hard to dismiss. One of the clearest windows into this transition comes from the Nile Valley. Cemeteries from around 12 to 13,000 years ago, such as Jebel Sahaba, in what is now Sudan, display a high rate of violent trauma, with dozens of individuals killed by projectile weapons. But a few thousand years later, in the Neolithic cemeteries of Egypt, the proportion of violent deaths falls sharply. The rise of agriculture along the Nile, with its dependable floods and rich fields, may have created conditions in which disputes were channeled through emerging social structures rather than constant raids. Later, with the rise of the pharaohs, violence became the prerogative of armies and rulers, not the everyday fate of villagers. Across Europe, similar patterns appear. Early Neolithic cemeteries sometimes contain evidence of massacres, but overall the rates of violent death decline compared to the Mesolithic. Sites in Central Europe, for instance, show a marked drop in skeletal trauma once farming villages were established. It seems that life in a village with wooden walls and collective fields, however monotonous, offered more security than life as a small band moving from one risky camp to another. This shift matters because it challenges some of our intuitions. We often imagine the small-scale societies of the distant past as peaceful Edens, corrupted only when civilization brought hierarchy and armies. But the bones suggest almost the reverse, that violence was proportionally more common in those small-scale societies, and that larger organised communities, for all their new inequities, may have brought relative safety from sudden violent death. This does not mean progress was smooth or universal. There were spikes in violence associated with particular regions or times of upheaval. Climate fluctuations could bring scarcity that reignited conflict. Cultural practices like human sacrifice introduced new forms of institutional violence. And of course, the rise of states brought the capacity for wars on a scale impossible before. But when measured by the percentage of skeletons showing fatal trauma, the deep trend from the Mesolithic through the Bronze Age is one of decline. The implications are unsettling. If we look at the archaeological record alone, it suggests that violence is not a fixed constant but a variable, one that rises or falls with the structure of society. We are not condemned to Hobbes's endless war, nor are we guaranteed Rousseau's gentle peace. We are shaped by circumstance, by scarcity or abundance, by the presence or absence of institutions that can contain our quarrels. And so the bones whisper a paradox. The invention of agriculture, often blamed for inequality and drudgery, may also have reduced the likelihood of dying violently. Cities, often cursed for corruption and crowding, may also have made it easier to survive without killing one's neighbours. What looks like decline in one dimension may have been progress in another. The haunting question remains, If larger societies reduced everyday violence, why did they also create the conditions for the most devastating wars of all? How can whole male lineages disappear? It sounds like myth, the kind of sweeping story told around fires about vanquished tribes and forgotten kings. Yet this is not legend. It is written in the double helix of the genomes that have been recovered from burials across Europe and Asia. When geneticists pieced together the DNA of ancient populations, they found something astonishing. In many places, the Y chromosome lines of earlier male groups simply vanish in the span of a few centuries, replaced almost entirely by newcomers from the eastern steppe. Entire paternal ancestries were erased so thoroughly that only echoes remain in the genetic tapestry of today. The story begins around 5,000 years ago, when a population we call the Yamnaya moved westward out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian seas. These were herders, mobile and resilient, living with cattle, sheep and horses in a landscape that demanded movement. Archaeology shows that their wagons and domesticated animals gave them an advantage in mobility. When they expanded westward, they encountered the settled farming populations of Europe, who had lived for millennia cultivating fields and building megalithic monuments. Within a few centuries, the genetic record shows a profound transformation. In much of northern and western Europe, as much as 70 to 90% of the Y chromosome lineages trace back to the incoming steppe groups. The autosomal or overall genetic mix reflects blending, with significant continuity from the earlier farmers. But the male line tells a different story. Somewhere in this encounter, the paternal lines of the local farmers were largely extinguished. The question is how? Some scholars suggest warfare, that mobile herders, armed with advanced weapons and capable of rapid movement, overwhelmed the farmers. Others point to disease, particularly the possible role of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium later infamous as the plague. Ancient DNA from skeletons of this period has yielded traces of early plague strains. It is possible that steppe expansions coincided with outbreaks that devastated farming populations, weakening them and allowing newcomers to dominate. In such a scenario, the collapse of male lineages could reflect both mortality from disease and social systems, where surviving women were absorbed into the incoming communities. There is also the darker possibility of systematic violence. Archaeology has uncovered evidence of mass killings in certain late Neolithic sites, with pits containing executed men, women and children. While not every site can be linked directly to the steppe expansions, these episodes remind us that population change was not always peaceful. When male lineages vanish from the record, one plausible cause is the deliberate elimination of arrival males, while women and children were incorporated. This is a pattern observed repeatedly in human history and uncomfortably across the animal kingdom as well. The corded were culture, which emerged in Central and Northern Europe around 4,700 years ago, shows strong genetic ties to the Yamnaya. Within a few generations, corded were communities dominated regions that had once been the domain of Neolithic farmers. Archaeology shows changes in burial practices, pottery styles and settlement structures, all coinciding with the genetic turnover. Similarly, in Western Europe, the later Bell Beaker culture carried significant steppe ancestry, spreading across vast distances and leaving a genetic imprint still detectable today. What makes the story so striking is the speed. We are used to thinking of population change as a slow blending, generations of intermarriage and migration. But the genomic evidence suggests something more abrupt, a demographic storm that swept across continents. Within a few hundred years, an eye blink in archaeological time, the male lines of earlier Europeans were almost entirely replaced. The implications are sobering. It means that what we often imagine as stable farming societies were fragile in the face of mobile herders with different strategies of survival. It also means that cultural innovations like wagons, horses, and possibly pastoral raiding may have carried not just economic advantages, but the power to reshape the very genetic structure of continents. Yet the disappearance of male lineages does not mean total extermination. Autosomal DNA shows that the earlier farmers live on in blended form. The story is not one of simple replacement, but of asymmetry. Women and children absorbed, men erased. This asymmetry itself speaks to the social dynamics of conquest. Power in these encounters was unevenly distributed, and gender was at its core. Why did these storms from the steppe happen when they did? One clue lies in climate. Around this time, the 3rd millennium BCE, parts of the Eurasian steppe experienced episodes of aridification. Mobility, pastoral herding, and flexible subsistence strategies gave steppe groups resilience. Farming communities rooted to specific plots of land may have been less adaptable. A mobile society can move when grass fails. A farmer cannot as easily move a field. This ecological flexibility, paired with new technologies of transport and possibly weapons, created a demographic advantage that cascaded westward. We are left with haunting questions. How much of this transformation was conscious violence? How much was the unintended consequence of microbes travelling with herders and their animals? How much was the outcome of women choosing survival within stronger groups when their own communities collapsed? Archaeology can show us graves, weapons, and DNA sequences, but it cannot tell us the precise moment when a man raised a weapon against a rival, or when a woman decided to join her conquerors rather than perish. The steppe storms are a reminder that history is not always a story of gradual progress or harmonious blending. Sometimes it is the story of rapid upheavals in which whole male lineages disappear, leaving silence where once there were fathers and sons. And yet, paradoxically, these storms are also part of the ancestry of most people in Europe and beyond today. The conquerors did not remain separate. They became ancestors too. In reflecting on this, we see both the fragility and resilience of our species. Lineages can vanish in centuries, yet the genetic record remains braided, carrying forward fragments of many peoples. Violence and disease may erase names, but not all traces. We are the living evidence of storms that remade the world 5,000 years ago. And so, we return to the question with which we began. How can whole male lineages disappear? The answer lies in a combination of violence, disease, ecological change, and social absorption. It is not one factor, but many, converging in a perfect storm. The haunting question is whether this was a unique episode in human history, or simply one of many hidden demographic revolutions still waiting to be uncovered in the DNA of the dead. If the genetic storm of the steppe swept across Europe broadly, it reached hurricane force at the western edge of the continent. Iberia, the peninsula that would later become Spain and Portugal, shows one of the starkest cases of male line replacement ever recorded. Ancient DNA studies have revealed that around 4,500 years ago, nearly all local Y chromosome lineages vanish, replaced almost entirely by steppe-derived ones. The overall ancestry of the population remained mixed. Women from earlier Iberian farming groups were still present in large numbers, but the paternal lines were almost wholly reset. This is not a trivial footnote. It means that within only a few centuries, the male descendants of Neolithic Iberians, who had farmed and built monumental structures for millennia, disappeared from the record. The women of those communities carried their children into a new genetic future, but their husbands, fathers and sons did not survive in the same way. The mechanism of this turnover is still debated. Was it direct violence, raiding and killing of men? Was it the spread of plague that disproportionately affected farming settlements? Or was it a social system in which incoming steppe males secured dominance through alliances, marriages and hierarchies that gradually extinguished the older paternal lines? Archaeology cannot give us a single answer, but the starkness of the genetic record leaves little doubt that something extreme occurred. A similar pattern emerges in Britain slightly later, around 4,000 years ago. Here, the arrival of groups associated with the beaker phenomenon reshaped the population even more dramatically. Within a few hundred years, over 90% of the island's genetic ancestry was replaced by steppe-related lineages. Earlier Neolithic traditions that had built stone circles like Stonehenge and long barrows vanished, replaced by new burial rites and pottery styles. The scale of demographic change is so profound that some scholars describe it as near-total population turnover. Again, the question is how? Did the beaker groups come in waves that steadily absorbed and outcompeted local groups? Was there violent conflict, or did disease sweep the island first, softening resistance? Perhaps both. The archaeological record shows continuity in monuments. Stonehenge was still in use after the newcomers arrived. But behind the rituals, the genetic makeup of the people had shifted almost entirely. The stones endured. but the families who built them did not. Taken together, Iberia and Britain illustrate the extremes of the steppe storms. These were not slow blends, but sudden ruptures in population history, reshaping not only cultures, but the very ancestry of those regions. And while we can point to wagons, herding, disease and warfare as contributing factors, the truth is that the lived experience of those centuries remains beyond full recovery. What we do know is that the echoes of those vanished male lineages are gone forever, and in their place stand the ancestors who carried the storm forward. Were civilizations built on conquest, or do we only remember the ones that were? By the first millennium before the Common Era, violence had ceased to be the work of a single spear or a small clan raid. It had become the machinery of states. War was no longer about defending a watering hole or seizing a pasture. It was about building an empire, about inscribing domination onto landscapes with iron and fire, and about reshaping the memory of entire peoples so thoroughly that only ruins and echoes remained. The Assyrians of Mesopotamia are often the first name that comes to mind when scholars speak of war as a state-building force. From the 9th century before the Common Era onward, they mastered the art of terror as a deliberate political tool. Stone reliefs from their palaces do not shy away from cruelty. They show impaled enemies displayed at city gates, prisoners flayed alive, and heads stacked in grotesque piles. This was not random brutality, it was calculated messaging. To resist Assyrian armies was to court obliteration. To submit was to live, though only under the weight of tribute and forced resettlement. The Assyrians pioneered mass deportations, moving entire populations across the empire to break resistance and cede loyalty. Their armies relied on iron weaponry, siege engines, and organised logistics that prefigured the standing armies of later empires. Violence was not an accident of their rise, it was the scaffolding. 1,000 years later, the Romans perfected another form of conquest. Their violence was immense but paired with absorption. Where the Assyrians ruled by fear, Rome ruled by incorporation. Conquered peoples might lose their freedom on the battlefield, but in time they might gain Roman citizenship. Roads and aqueducts stitched territories together, yet they were laid down by legions that first crushed opposition. Roman peace, the famous Pax Romana, was a peace resting on the sword. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul in the 1st century before the Common Era is often held up as a case study. Ancient sources describe hundreds of thousands of deaths and the enslavement of many more. Whether the figures are exaggerated or not, the principle is clear. Violence was the entry fee to empire, even for a polity that prided itself on law and order. Move forward again, this time into the 13th century of the Common Era, and the Mongols demonstrate yet another model. Their empire rose from the steppe with unmatched speed, stretching from the shores of China to the heart of Hungary in barely a lifetime. They too used fear deliberately. Cities that resisted were annihilated, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. Those that surrendered without a fight were often spared, absorbed into the Mongol system of tribute and trade. This dual strategy made Genghis Khan and his successors not just conquerors, but architects of the largest contiguous empire in history. Violence cleared the path, but commerce and communication filled it in. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol rule, protected by the same armies that had burned cities to the ground. What all three empires show is that large-scale violence was not an aberration of civilization, but a central mechanism of it. Warfare fed the state, whether through captured resources, enslaved labour, or sheer intimidation. Walls and monuments we still visit today were often built by hands forced into labour after war. The great libraries, the temples, the roads, many rest on bones. This raises the unsettling possibility that our deepest achievements may be inseparable from organised cruelty. But there is a contrast worth noting. Early human violence, as seen in the graves of hunter-gatherers or the massacres of farming villages, was sporadic, intimate and local. Empires industrialised it. War became bureaucratic. Scribes recorded tribute, generals deployed supply lines, engineers built siege towers, and propaganda justified campaigns as the will of gods or the necessity of order. Violence was scaled up, rationalised, and sometimes even celebrated as a civilising act. This shift forces us to ask whether civilization was built despite war or through it, and yet, empires were also fragile. The Assyrians collapsed under the weight of their enemies' coalitions. Rome, despite centuries of dominance, fractured under internal strife and external pressure. The Mongols, once unstoppable, split into rival khanates. Violence may have built these empires, but it also unbuilt them. A state born in conquest must continually feed the machine, and when the machine falters, collapse follows swiftly. If we step back, the pattern suggests something sobering. Violence has often been the midwife of empire, but it has rarely been its long-term guarantor. What endures are the roads, the ideas, and sometimes the myths of unity. The question then lingers in the quiet. Could civilizations have been born without conquest? Or is war simply the price humanity has always paid for scale? Beyond the Assyrians, the Romans, and the Mongols, other empires across the world reveal the same pattern in different cultural clothing. The Aztecs of central Mexico, rising in the 14th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, turned warfare into ritual. Battles were not simply about land or tribute. They were also about bodies for sacrifice. Captives taken in war were offered to the gods on temple steps, their deaths believed to keep the cosmos turning. Violence here was not just pragmatic but cosmological. It shaped religion, statecraft, and spectacle. For the Aztecs, empire was inseparable from the ritualized spilling of blood. Their neighbors, the Tarascans and Mixtecs, shared in the cycles of raiding and defense, but it was the Aztecs who made warfare the central pillar of their society until Spanish conquest ended their empire in its own violent upheaval. Far to the east, in China, dynasties rose and fell in rhythms marked by the clash of armies. The Qin dynasty of the 3rd century before the Common Era unified warring states through brutal campaigns, welding them into a centralized empire under Qin Shi Huang. The walls and standardized measures he imposed came only after conquest had subdued rivals. Later dynasties, from the Han to the Tang, carried this forward. War on the frontiers secured trade routes, and violence inside quelled uprisings. Yet China also shows how empires often frame their warfare as the restoration of order rather than the pursuit of expansion. Where the Assyrians flaunted terror, Chinese dynasties often spoke of harmony restored, though harmony always came at the tip of a spear. In South Asia, the Maurya and later the Mughal empires built their dominance on violence tempered by administration. Ashoka, remembered today for his turn toward Buddhism and non-violence, first secured his throne through bloody conquest, most famously the Kalinga War. In his own edicts he describes the horror of the battlefield, the tens of thousands killed, the despair among survivors. His remorse led to reforms, but the violence had already served its function. Without the war, there would have been no empire for him to reform. This paradox recurs: states grow by violence, and sometimes only afterward do they claim the mantle of peace. Even in Africa, where written sources are fewer, archaeology and oral traditions point to similar cycles. The kingdom of Kush, north of modern Sudan, fought wars with both pharaonic Egypt and later Rome. The Ashanti Empire of West Africa relied on armies to extend control over trade routes and rival states. Violence carved borders, but trade and culture filled them in. Taken together, these examples underline a theme. Civilizations did not stumble into war reluctantly. They wielded it as an instrument of scale. Empires justified conquest in different ways: terror, ritual sacrifice, harmony, divine will, but the result was the same. Territories expanded, populations were moved or absorbed, and the architecture of power grew from the ruins of battle. And still, beneath the grandeur of walls, temples, and chronicles lies the unanswered question. If empire has so often been born in conquest, does that mean large-scale cooperation was only possible after large-scale violence? Or are we simply biased by what survives, remembering the states forged in war because their monuments endured, while forgetting smaller, more peaceful societies that left no palaces to visit? Are we really living in history's most peaceful era? It sounds almost absurd when the headlines tell us of wars and shootings every day, when news channels lean on crime and conflict to fill their cycles. And yet, the numbers suggest something deeply counterintuitive. If you had to choose a century in which to be born, purely on the odds of surviving violence, the 21st century might be one of the best choices ever offered to a human being. But to understand why, we need to trace how violence shifted over the past 400 years, and how both scholars and critics have tried to make sense of the decline. The 17th century was, in many ways, an age of catastrophe. Europe convulsed in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. That conflict killed an estimated 8 million people, a staggering toll for a continent whose population was only around 100 million. At the same time, colonial conquest unfolded across the Americas, Africa and Asia, spreading not only muskets and steel but also disease and forced labour systems. To the individuals caught in this turbulence, the world did not look like it was moving toward peace. It looked like endless fire and loss. And yet, buried in the record books, something was shifting beneath the surface, the slow but steady decline of interpersonal homicide. Across European cities, from Amsterdam to London to Paris, court records reveal that homicide rates in the late Middle Ages were shockingly high by modern standards. In the 13th and 14th centuries, rates of killing in some towns were 20 to 40 per 100,000 people per year. By the 17th century, those numbers had already begun to drop, and by the 18th and 19th centuries, the decline was unmistakable. Homicides fell to single digits per 100,000, and eventually to fewer than one in many Western countries. That change was not the result of people suddenly becoming more virtuous. It was the result of something colder and more structural: the rise of centralized states, legal systems, and what sociologists call the monopoly on violence. The German sociologist Max Weber described the state as the entity that claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within its borders. In other words, if you want to hit your neighbour with a stick in the street, the state insists you cannot. Only the state's police or military can wield violence legally, and even then, under controlled circumstances. This was not a moral revolution so much as a bureaucratic one. As monarchies consolidated power, as parliaments and legal codes expanded, the costs of private feuding rose and the risks of punishment grew. Interpersonal violence was squeezed out, redirected into courts, prisons, and armies. This is the core of Steven Pinker's famous argument in The Better Angels of Our Nature, published in 2011. He claimed that human violence has declined dramatically over centuries, and that we now live in the most peaceful era of our species. He points to homicide data, to the outlawing of practices like torture and slavery, to the spread of human rights, and to the absence of direct wars between great powers since the end of the Second World War. By his account, our instincts for violence remain, but institutions, norms, and global connections have curbed them. The data does show striking patterns. Take Europe's homicide rates again. In Italy, in the 14th century, dozens of killings per 100,000 were common. Today, the figure hovers under 1. In England, the medieval rate was around 20 to 30. Today, it is below 1. Across much of the world, barring pockets of instability, the long arc bends downward. Torture devices that once stood openly in public squares are now locked away in museums. Public executions, once spectacles for thousands, have nearly vanished. Practices like duelling, legal in much of Europe until the 19th century, disappeared as the state tightened its grip. In this sense, Pinker is right. The everyday brutality of past centuries was far greater than many people realise. But critics urge caution. The decline of homicide in Europe is clear, they argue, but Pinker risks overextending that data to all of humanity. In colonial contexts, for example, the story looks very different. Indigenous populations of the Americas suffered catastrophic losses after European arrival, not only from disease but also from violence, enslavement, and dispossession. Some estimates suggest that 90% of indigenous populations were wiped out in the first centuries after Columbus. This is hardly evidence of a decline in violence. It is one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. Critics argue that any account of declining violence must grapple with the fact that one region's pacification may coincide with another's devastation. There are also questions about the 20th century. Pinker emphasises the decline in great power wars after 1945, and he is right that the so-called Long Peace, no direct wars between nuclear-armed states for nearly 80 years, is unprecedented. But the century was also home to the bloodiest conflicts in human history. The First and Second World Wars together killed over 100 million people. Genocides in Armenia, the Holocaust, Rwanda and Cambodia, remind us that violence did not vanish. It shifted in scale and form. Critics like John Gray and others accuse Pinker of cherry-picking, of focusing on long-term trends while downplaying catastrophic spikes. Still, the long-term view remains stubborn. If you were to plot human deaths from violence as a proportion of total population over the millennia, the line does slope downward. Prehistoric cemeteries like Jebel Sahaba or Nataruk suggest that 10 to 20% of individuals in some groups died violently. In the 17th century, wars like the 30 Years' War consumed 5 to 10% of entire populations. By contrast, the Second World War, horrific as it was, killed about 4% of the world's people. And the wars of the 21st century, though tragic, have not yet approached those percentages. The scale of absolute death remains immense, but the proportion compared to total human population is smaller than in the past. Another piece of the puzzle is the rise of international organisations and peacekeeping. The United Nations, established in 1945, has often been mocked for its inefficiencies. Yet peacekeeping missions have reduced the recurrence of conflict in many regions. Agreements against chemical weapons, landmines and nuclear proliferation, however imperfectly enforced, reflect a growing norm that not all means of violence are acceptable. International tribunals, from Nuremberg to The Hague, mark a new era where even heads of state can, at least in theory, be held accountable. Skeptics warn us not to be complacent. Declines are not guaranteed to continue. Climate change, resource scarcity, and authoritarian backlashes could reverse trends. The risk of nuclear war has not disappeared, it has simply been held at bay by fragile deterrents. And modern technologies, from drones to cyber warfare, open new avenues for conflict we are only beginning to understand. So where does this leave us? If we compare our present to the bloody past of mass graves and feuding clans, yes, we are living in one of the most peaceful eras in human history. But if we compare ourselves to the peace we imagine possible, we are still far from it. Violence has not been eliminated, it has been transformed, managed, hidden behind state authority, or outsourced to distant battlefields. The long decline may be real, but it is fragile, contingent, and uneven. And perhaps the haunting question is this: if peace today rests on structures like states, treaties, and global institutions, what happens if those structures falter? Will the trend continue downward, or will we discover that the veneer of peace was thinner than we hoped? If we shift our lens from grand statistics to the messiness of recent decades, the picture of declining violence grows even more complicated. The end of the Cold War in the 1990s was hailed as a triumph of diplomacy and deterrence, and the data does suggest that major interstate wars became rarer. But this so-called peace dividend was not evenly distributed. Instead of continent-wide wars between empires, conflicts erupted within states, civil wars in the Balkans, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and beyond. These wars often drew in outside powers, peacekeeping missions or humanitarian interventions, but they rarely resembled the clear victories and treaties of earlier centuries. Consider Bosnia in the 1990s. In the heart of Europe, cities like Sarajevo endured sieges, artillery bombardments, and massacres. The Srebrenica genocide, in which more than 8,000 men and boys were executed, remains one of the darkest moments on the continent since the Second World War. Here, the presence of international peacekeepers did not prevent catastrophe, and the lesson was sobering. Peacekeeping only works when the mandate is strong and the political will exists to enforce it. Contrast this with Sierra Leone, where a brutal civil war raged through the 1990s, infamous for the use of child soldiers and the mutilation of civilians. When United Nations forces finally intervened robustly in the early 2000s, alongside British military assistance, the conflict was eventually stabilised, and disarmament programs succeeded in reducing violence. The difference between failure and success, again, lay not in human nature but in institutions, resources and choices. Then there is Rwanda, where in 1994 nearly 1 million people were killed in the span of about 100 days. The genocide showed that while long-term homicide rates might be falling globally, the potential for rapid, organised and devastating violence still lurks within human societies. It was not an ancient tribal impulse that drove the killings, but political manipulation, propaganda, and the deliberate mobilisation of neighbours against neighbours. The global community's slow response remains a painful reminder. that decline in overall rates does not mean the end of atrocities. And yet, when historians and political scientists zoom out, the frequency and intensity of wars per capita are still trending downward. The world after 1945 has not seen a direct clash between superpowers. Many conflicts today, from Syria to Yemen, are devastating locally, but do not draw entire continents into the fire as the world wars once did. Even when wars break out, they are often followed by negotiations, international monitoring, and reconstruction efforts that would have been unthinkable centuries earlier. All of this forces us into a kind of uneasy humility. Violence has not vanished, and it never will. But the conditions under which it flourishes or recedes are clearer than ever. Strong institutions, cultural norms against cruelty, and international cooperation. The decline of violence, if real, is not the story of angels overtaking demons in the human heart. It is the story of fragile systems that hold back the darker possibilities of our species. The haunting question is whether those systems can endure the storms of the future, or whether they will one day fracture and remind us of how thin the walls between peace and violence have always been. By now, after wandering through caves and bones, through grave pits and spear tips, through the skull fractures of long-forgotten cousins and the ruins left behind by empires, we arrive at a question that has always lingered in the background. Can we ever escape the division between us and them? It is a deceptively simple question. For millions of years, our ancestors survived by paying close attention to who was safe and who was not. At first, the danger came from the shadows, from leopards and saber-toothed cats. Later, as we learned to hold stones and fire, the danger shifted to each other. To be human has always meant to be social, but it has also meant drawing lines. Kin and stranger, ally and enemy, us and them. And yet, looking back over the span from 6 million years ago to this moment, there is something remarkable. That line has never been fixed. It has shifted, expanded, contracted, and shifted again, shaped by chance, by genes, and by culture. What counted as us 50,000 years ago was a handful of foragers tied by blood. What counted as us 5,000 years ago could stretch to a city, a kingdom, perhaps an empire. Today, in theory at least, our us can stretch to a species spread across every continent. But the question remains open, as it always has. How far can that circle expand before the old instincts pull us back into division? The archaeologist Pat Shipman once pointed out that even the first pieces of jewellery may have carried this message. When hunters from one valley met others, they needed ways to say quickly, "I belong to this group, not yours." Those shells and beads were not just pretty. They were flags, worn on the body. That was 40,000 years ago, but the habit never left us. From painted faces to uniforms, from wedding rings to passports, humans still mark themselves with signs of belonging. The tragedy is that with every marker of belonging there comes the shadow of exclusion. To say, "I am one of us," is to imply there are others who are not. And yet it is precisely that double edge which makes us so difficult to classify as inherently violent or inherently peaceful. The same instinct that makes us nurture our own also tempts us to harm those we see as outside. The same language that allows us to share myths and lore can be used to dehumanize and rally hatred. Every scientific study of violence has returned to this paradox. There is no single human essence, no gene or skull shape that dooms us to bloodshed. But neither is there a utopian switch that frees us of it forever. The bones whisper the same story. At Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, at Nataruk in Kenya, at Talheim in Germany, we find evidence of groups destroyed in sudden moments of brutality. Yet in those same centuries and millennia, countless other communities must have lived without leaving such scars. The mass graves are easy to excavate. The peaceful stretches vanish into silence. The archaeological record is biased toward the violent because trauma leaves marks that bones can hold. Quiet coexistence, marriages between groups, long trade routes of obsidian or shells, these pass without leaving skeletons pierced by stone tips. We must be careful, then, not to confuse what survives in Earth with the whole of what was. And so, if we are honest, we cannot say with certainty that our ancestors lived in constant warfare. The evidence for violence is undeniable, but the evidence for cooperation is just as real. Shared technologies, care for the injured, and the astonishing persistence of humans in all kinds of environments. Even in the darkest sites, like Mulagirsi with its cut-marked Neanderthal bones, there remains ambiguity. Was it cruelty or starvation? Was it ritual or desperation? Our task is not to give simple answers, but to admit the complexity, to hold the contradictions in our hands like the heavy stone tools those ancestors once made. When we step back even further, comparing ourselves with chimpanzees and bonobos, we see reflections of both possibilities. Chimps wage coordinated raids, ambushing rivals with an unsettling familiarity. Bonobos, on the other hand, have found different solutions, using alliances and intimacy to diffuse tension. The genetic distance between us and them is tiny, yet the behavioural divergence is immense. If anything, their existence tells us that nothing about human violence is inevitable. Evolution provides tendencies, but culture steers them into paths. The philosophers of the past wrestled with the same paradox. Hobbes, looking at the English Civil War, saw humans as nasty and brutish, without the strong arm of the state. Rousseau, looking at tales of distant peoples, imagined a purer innocence ruined by civilization. Aristotle called us political animals, unable to live without the polis. Confucian thought, in another tradition, emphasized harmony and the cultivation of virtue. Each view captured a part of the truth, none captured the whole. They did not have bones from Atapuerca or mass graves from the Neolithic, but their intuition was the same. Human nature is not fixed, but oscillates depending on circumstance. That leaves us sitting here in the 21st century, in a strange position. On the one hand, we can count ourselves lucky. The probability of being killed by another human being is lower now than it was for most of our past. Wars still rage, but compared to the burning of whole continents during the World Wars, the scale is smaller. Homicide rates, when tracked across centuries, have steadily declined in many places. On the other hand, the old instincts are never far. Nationalism, ethnic rivalry, dehumanization of enemies, all remain tools waiting to be picked up again. The line between us and them may shrink, but it has never been erased. So the haunting question returns: can we ever live without that division? Some scientists argue we already see glimpses of it in the expansion of moral circles. Abolition, human rights, humanitarian aid. These are cultural inventions that would make little sense to a small foraging band. They are evidence that our empathy can extend far beyond kin, even across oceans. Others caution that empathy is fragile and easily manipulated. A single slogan or rumour can contract the circle again in days. What is certain is that there was no master plan. The path from prey animal to apex predator to empire builder was not mapped out in advance. It was shaped by chance climate shifts, by pathogens, by random mutations, and by the fragile survival of small groups. The fact that our species survived at all, while so many others fell away, is already a statistical fluke. We inherit that fragile victory every day without noticing it, and perhaps that is where this story of violence leaves us. Not with a final answer, but with an invitation to awareness. The line between us and them is not an iron law of biology. It is a habit, one carved into us over millennia of fear and survival. Habits can change. The same brain that learned to flake stones learned to write poetry, to share food, to imagine rights. The question is whether we are willing to see that potential, or whether we will keep drawing smaller circles, shutting more people out. So if you find yourself lying awake at night, wondering whether humans are doomed to repeat the same mistakes, you are not alone. Scholars wrestle with the same insomnia. Archaeologists unearth the same questions. The bones do not tell us whether peace is possible. They only remind us that the division between us and them has always been written in soft clay, not in stone. The firelight flickers, the circle shifts, and the story continues. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, And tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.